Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. It started as an ordinary Sunday drive through the countryside. I'd packed a few snacks, some music, and planned to spend the day exploring the old back roads, places I hadn't visited in years. The sun was shining, casting long shadows across the fields as I drove along, lost in the quiet hum of the engine and the occasional chirping of birds. My destination was a small, forgotten town deep in the woods. It wasn't marked on any maps or GPS. It was one of those places that only showed up if you knew where to look. I had vague memories of visiting there as a kid, but everything had changed since then. The road wound tighter into the trees, and as I drove deeper, the world felt as if it was folding in around me. I was eager for the quiet, for a break from the city, but the stillness of the woods began to feel oppressive, almost too quiet. It was as though the trees were watching, the silence pressing down like a weight. Eventually, I reached the old town, or what was left of it. Time had all but erased it. The town was overgrown with vines, the wooden houses leaning in on themselves, abandoned and forgotten. There were no signs of life, no people, no vehicles, just a faint echo of the past. I parked my car near the edge of what was once Main Street and started walking. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, cracked and covered in weeds. The air smelled damp and musty, like something had been left to rot. I passed the old general store, its windows broken and faded posters peeling away. I peeked inside and saw remnants of a life long gone, dusty shelves, faded signs, and the unmistakable scent of decay. Something about it made my skin crawl, but curiosity drove me forward. I wandered through the town, stumbling over old bricks and rusted metal, feeling as though I was stepping through a memory. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet, my footsteps echoing off the crumbling walls, the creak of dry wood, the distant call of birds. It was peaceful, yet unsettling. As the sun began to set, I reached the outskirts of town. I sat on an old stone bench, trying to take in the view of the overgrown fields and the distant horizon. The quiet seemed to stretch forever, the woods pressing closer with each passing moment. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first. A whisper. It wasn't human, but something inhuman. I froze, my heart pounding. I strained my ears, listening, but the woods remained silent except for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The whisper grew louder, as if it was circling around me, distant but persistent. I stood, my hands trembling, and turned in a slow circle, searching for the source. The woods were darkening, the last light of day vanishing behind the trees. Then, just beyond the edge of my vision, I saw it. Movement. A shadow, shifting among the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It didn't look human. It was tall, too tall, and its figure twisted unnaturally as if it didn't belong in the world. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The whisper became a soft, eerie chant now, growing louder and more insistent. The figure moved closer, the shadow stretching and twisting as it approached. I could feel its presence, as if it were staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. It wasn't human, not in the way I knew. It was something older, something that had been waiting for a long, long time. Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled backward. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation, but nothing made sense. The figure was no longer a shape, but a dark void, surrounding me in silence and fear. Just when I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, the whisper faded. The figure stood still for a moment, then turned, vanishing into the woods as silently as it had come. I stood there, trembling, as the night fully set in. The woods were silent once again, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. That thing, whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting. I slowly made my way back to my car, heart still racing. As I drove away, I glanced back at the town once more. the memories of the whisper still echoing in my mind. I haven't gone back since. I never thought a simple trip to the library could haunt me like that. It was an ordinary evening, nothing out of the ordinary. I had just finished dinner and decided to visit the library downtown. I'd always loved the quiet, the smell of old books, the calmness of the place. It was something I did regularly, but that night felt different. The library was quiet, like usual, with only a few people scattered around, their heads buried in books or computers. I liked the peaceful hum of pages turning and the faint sound of the old fluorescent lights buzzing above. It felt like time moved slower there. I spent the evening reading, drifting through the stacks until I found myself in the back of the building. That's where the old section was, filled with dusty aged books no one really touched. It was peaceful, almost serene. But something was off. I remember feeling like I was being watched. The feeling started slowly, creeping up on me. I dismissed it at first, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it, a faint whispering. I turned, looking around, but there was no one there. The whispering continued, just soft enough that I couldn't make out the words. It was almost as if someone was speaking right next to my ear, but nothing was there. I tried to ignore it, convinced I was imagining things. Still, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I decided to leave, but as I passed the long row of bookshelves, I noticed something strange. At the end of the row stood a figure, tall and thin, just standing there in the dim light. Its face was obscured by the shadow, but its posture was unnervingly unnatural, like it wasn't quite human. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I blinked, trying to convince myself it wasn't real, but when I looked again, the figure hadn't moved. My legs felt like they were made of stone. I couldn't look away. There was something about it that didn't belong, something wrong. Then, in a voice that wasn't human, it whispered my name, soft but chilling. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the figure. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and tried to yell for help, but the sound got caught in my throat. Suddenly, the figure turned and disappeared between the rows of books. I stood there, frozen, unsure whether I had imagined it or not. The whispering continued, though fainter now, as though it were coming from within the very walls of the library. I rushed to the entrance, clutching my phone tightly in my hand. I couldn't leave fast enough. As I pushed open the heavy doors, I glanced back one last time. The library was still. Too still. The buzzing fluorescent lights flickered once before dying out, plunging the building into darkness. I never went back to that library. To this day, I don't know if what I saw was real, but the whispering still lingers in the back of my mind, and I'll never forget the figure that vanished between the rows of books. It was late October, the leaves crunching beneath my feet as I made my way down the quiet country road. I had decided to take a long walk that evening, needing some fresh air away from the dull hum of city life. The sun was setting, casting long dark shadows over the rolling hills, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of trees in the breeze. I'd grown up in this area, a small town surrounded by farmland and open spaces. The woods were always eerie at night, but tonight felt different. The air was colder, heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I walked, I noticed how distant the usual sounds of animals had become. No crickets, no rustling of leaves, just silence. Even the wind had quieted. I reached the edge of the woods, the trees towering like silent sentinels on either side of the road. The sun had nearly set now, leaving only a dim orange glow on the horizon. It was too early to be this dark. That's when I saw it, standing between two trees, perfectly still, a figure watching me from the shadows. It was human-shaped, but there was something off about it. Its posture was wrong, unnatural. I stopped walking, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. I stood there, heart pounding, unsure if I should move or run. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It was like something out of a nightmare, just a shadow in the fading light. My legs felt frozen as I tried to look away, but something held my gaze. Who's there? My voice trembled as I forced the words out. The silence stretched on, and then nothing. No response, no sound of breathing, no movement. I wanted to run. I turned back toward the road, but as I did, I saw another figure appear in the distance, emerging from the opposite side of the woods. This one was even closer than I thought possible. It didn't walk, it glided, silently, effortlessly. My stomach twisted as I realized it wasn't human. The shape was wrong, distorted, like something had stretched it out of proportion. My mind raced as I backed away, hands trembling, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I was nearly at the edge of the road. The two figures, now several feet apart, stood motionless, their black, empty eyes staring toward me. I realized, with a sick feeling in my stomach, that I hadn't heard any footsteps, just silence. And yet they were there, both of them, in the middle of nowhere, watching me. I turned and ran, my legs carrying me as fast as they could, the figures vanishing into the darkness behind me. I never looked back. To this day, I don't know what they were, but I know they weren't human. My friends and I decided on a whim to take the long trail that stretched along the edge of the cliffs, far from any roads, towns, or lights. We wanted nothing but peace, a chance to get away from everything. We parked at the base of the trail, unloaded our backpacks, and began the slow ascent. The air was clear, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. It was peaceful. That was the only word for it. Peaceful. At first, we hiked for what felt like hours, the trail winding through thick patches of trees that would occasionally break into clearings with breathtaking views of the valley below. It was beautiful, like stepping into another world. At some point, we decided to stop for a break near the edge of the cliffs. The drop below wasn't something to mess with, but we sat there, taking in the view, enjoying the stillness. That's when things started to feel off. We noticed a faint noise, like someone dragging something heavy. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. At first, we figured it was just the wind shifting rocks or something. No big deal. But then, the sound grew closer. I got up, walking a few steps toward the edge of the trail, and strained my ears, trying to pinpoint it. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I blinked, and there it was again. A figure. At the edge of the cliff, maybe 50 feet below us, just standing there. No flashlight, no movement, just still, like a shadow cast by the rocks. I could barely make out the details, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. I called my friends over, but when they looked, there was nothing there. I didn't know what to say. My heart was racing as I tried to convince myself it was just some hiker far off in the distance. We decided to keep walking, thinking maybe we'd imagined it. The trail grew quieter the further we went, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer with each step. We came to a part of the trail where the ground dropped off steeply again, the cliff face towering above us. As we moved closer to that edge, the air seemed heavier. The noise returned, faint dragging footsteps but now accompanied by whispers, distant and soft. I could barely make out the words, but they sent chills down my spine. "We're still here," they said. My friends were laughing, unaware of what I'd heard. I looked around, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, but the unease in my chest was growing. The figure was still out there, watching us. I could feel its presence, even though I couldn't see it. We reached a part of the trail where the trees thinned, giving us a view of the valley again. Below, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another figure standing by the edge of the cliff far below, and then another, and another, until the entire expanse below was filled with dark shapes that seemed to be watching us, unmoving. I froze. My friends kept walking, oblivious, but I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice wouldn't come. The figures, there were dozens of them, seemed to blend into the shadows of the cliffs, but I could feel their eyes on me. I couldn't look away from the sight below, even as panic began to rise in my chest. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew they were waiting. I turned around and yelled at my friends to stop, but they couldn't hear me. I could barely hear myself. "Guys, stop!" I shouted, my voice barely more than a whisper. They were already too far ahead, unaware of what I had seen. I begged them to come back, but it was like they didn't even hear me. My mind was screaming, "Run back! Run back!" But my feet wouldn't move. My gaze was still locked on the figures far below. The dragging sound grew louder again, this time coming from above, behind me. I could feel something close, closer than it had been before. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw it. The figure from earlier, the one by the cliff, now standing just a few feet away from me. Its face wasn't visible, but I could feel it watching me. Its presence seemed to drown out everything else. The sound of my friends, the wind, everything except the slow, deliberate footsteps drawing closer. "We're still here," it whispered again, and I could feel its breath against my neck. I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure leaned in closer, and I swear I could feel its cold, lifeless stare boring into me. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The dragging noise and whispers faded. The figure stood there for a moment longer, then turned and slowly walked back into the shadows of the cliff. By some miracle, my friends finally heard me screaming, and they ran back to find me. We left that trail as fast as we could, but I can still feel it, like something is out there, waiting, still. I never liked going to the old library. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy reading, but something about that place always unsettled me. It was located deep in town, far from the bustling streets, surrounded by tall, looming trees that seemed to trap the library in perpetual dusk. That day, I had gone in looking for a quiet place to work on a research project. The main hall stretched out in front of me, filled with towering bookshelves packed with forgotten volumes. The air smelled of old paper and dust, like something had been left untouched for too long. I always felt like the library was too quiet, too still, as though the very walls were watching. I found a desk tucked into a corner near the back. The sun barely made it through the high, cracked windows, casting long, dim shadows across the worn wooden floor. I set up my laptop, opened my books, and tried to focus, but the oppressive quiet gnawed at the edges of my concentration. Hours passed, or at least it felt like it. I had no real sense of time in that place. Every creak, every faint whisper of wind from outside seemed magnified in the silence. I was halfway through a particularly dry section of text when I noticed something unusual. A faint noise, barely audible at first, like someone breathing just behind me. I froze, scanning the empty library, but there was no one there. The sound grew louder, sharper, like someone was just inches from my ear. I turned slowly, my pulse quickening. No one. The breathy noise became a low whisper, as though someone was right there speaking into my mind. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it felt off, like the voice wasn't human. I pushed my chair back, my hand trembling as I tried to steady myself. I wanted to run, but something about the stillness of the library held me in place. Then came a distinct echoing creak from the far corner of the room. I didn't want to look, but my head turned on its own. In the dim light, I saw something moving. Shadowy and indistinct, it wavered near the tallest shelf. A figure, barely formed, drifting in and out of sight. My breath caught in my throat. The whispering grew louder, distorted, like it was all around me now. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. It felt like the library itself had swallowed my voice. As I watched, the figure began to shift, growing more distinct. Its features were blurred, but I could see now. Hollow eyes, a twisted, gaping mouth. It didn't move like a person. It drifted, flowing across the room, closer to me. The whispering became a scream, but in my head, not from any source I could find. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair. The figure didn't stop. It didn't seem to notice me. It was as if it had no awareness of anything but its own existence. It drifted toward the front of the library, toward the rows of ancient books, each step sending a shudder through the floor. Tears streamed down my face as I stumbled out the door, never looking back. The library remained silent, as if it had never noticed I was gone. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't want to find out. But I know I'll never step foot in that library again. It was a quiet summer evening when my family and I decided to visit the old abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. The place had been closed for years, overtaken by weeds and forgotten rides rusting in the hot sun. The locals had always whispered strange stories about the park, rumors of eerie sounds, forgotten laughter, and ghostly apparitions. But we figured it'd be a fun adventure, something different from the usual weekend routines. As we arrived, the first thing that struck me was how still everything felt. There wasn't even the usual hum of insects, just a deathly silence. The entrance gate was broken, hanging open, as though it had been waiting for us. We made our way inside, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet echoing unnaturally loud. The park was larger than I had imagined, with rows of rides that looked like they had been forgotten by time. There was something eerie about the way the rides loomed over us, standing still, lifeless. The Ferris wheel sat motionless, its metal skeleton creaking as though it wanted to move, but couldn't. The funhouse with its broken windows looked like a hollow, crooked mouth, waiting to swallow whatever dared enter. We wandered through the park, taking it all in. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating. There was a strange smell, something metallic, mixed with decay. My dad insisted we move closer to the central plaza where the old carousel still stood. It was one of the last working attractions before the park shut down. But it wasn't just the carousel that caught my attention, it was the voices. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, whispering soft murmurs. But as we approached the plaza, I realized the sounds were coming from the carousel itself. A soft, eerie laughter. The kind of laughter that didn't belong in a place like this. Probably just the wind, Dad said, though his voice was quieter now, uncertain. But the laughter continued. Clearer, louder. It wasn't the wind. I stopped, frozen in my tracks. The sound came from the empty carousel, the horses frozen mid-gallop, their painted faces worn and cracked. I could hear them. Soft, childlike giggles, high-pitched and wrong, echoing across the dead park. Mom tried to assure me it was nothing. "It's just the old ride settling," she said, though her voice was shaky. But the laughter grew, becoming more distorted, more human. It didn't sound like kids playing. It sounded like something wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My skin crawled. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was as if something was there, something else. Dad grabbed my hand and pulled me along, saying we needed to leave, but something about that laughter kept following us. We rushed toward the exit, passing the old concession stand. But then, just as we neared the gate, the air grew colder. The silence became louder again, like a vacuum. That's when I noticed it. The Ferris wheel, still sitting there, its broken lights flickering. Only, it wasn't empty anymore. At the top of the Ferris wheel, a figure stood, motionless, staring down at us with hollow, empty eyes. There was no face, no features, just a void where the eyes should be. And that laughter, that awful, distorted laughter, came from it. I turned to my family, screaming to run, but when I looked back, the figure was gone. The Ferris wheel light stopped flickering, plunging the park back into darkness. We didn't look back. We didn't stop. We got into the car and drove away as fast as we could, the laughter still ringing in my ears. To this day, I don't know what we saw, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever was there, it wasn't human, and it never left that amusement park. It was a quiet evening, and I was driving down a deserted highway, the kind where the road stretches endlessly with nothing but fields and trees on either side. I had been driving for hours, heading home after a long trip, and the dim glow of my headlights was the only source of light in the endless blackness around me. The air was thick with the scent of rain, though no storms had come. The tires hummed on the road, and the only sound was the rhythmic click of the wipers clearing the occasional drops from my windshield. I hadn't seen another car in hours, not since leaving the last town, and I felt that familiar sense of isolation creeping in. As I turned a bend, the first thing I noticed was the old wooden sign. It was weathered and barely legible, but I could make out the faint outline of the words, Eagle Point, 5 miles. I didn't remember seeing a town named Eagle Point on any map, but the sign wasn't particularly unusual, just another small forgotten place along this endless stretch of road. I was tempted to speed up, eager to get home, but something about that sign pulled me in. Curiosity, maybe, or the strange sense of solitude that had settled over the drive. I took a slow turn down the narrow, winding road that led toward Eagle Point. As I approached, the first thing I noticed was how dark everything had become. The streetlights in this part of the country were practically non-existent. The only light came from the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the night. Eagle Point wasn't much of a town. A few houses stood in various states of disrepair, the yards overgrown and dotted with wildflowers and weeds. There was no one outside, no cars, no movement, just a stillness that seemed to stretch forever. I drove slowly through the quiet streets, my senses on edge. That's when I saw the church. It wasn't like the other buildings. It was old, its steeple towering above the others, casting long, dark shadows across the ground. There was something unsettling about it, the way the windows reflected the light like hollow, staring eyes. I slowed down and parked across the street, unsure of why I felt so drawn to it. I stepped out of my car and walked toward the church. The ground was soft beneath my feet, the sound of crunching gravel echoing in the stillness. The door creaked open slightly as I pushed it, revealing the dim interior. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the faint light from my phone. The pews were empty, and the air smelled musty, old. The silence felt heavier here. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, like the church itself was holding its breath, waiting. I wandered further inside, drawn by an odd sense of fascination and dread. In one corner of the church, there was an old faded photo framed and sitting atop a small altar. It depicted a group of people, women, men, and children, standing together, smiling. But their eyes were empty, vacant. As I stared at the photo, I felt my skin crawl. The stillness grew deeper, more suffocating. Then, from the back of the church, I heard it. A faint whisper, too soft to understand, but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat and I turned slowly, heart pounding. There was nothing there, just shadows in the corners, stretching and shifting. I backed away from the altar toward the door. That's when I noticed something strange. The photo was gone. In its place was another photo, newly placed on the altar. This one showed me, alone, standing by my car with an empty, hollow stare. Panic gripped me as I snatched the photo and backed toward the door. The whispering had grown louder now, echoing through the church like 1,000 voices speaking at once. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was haunting. I stumbled outside, the door slamming behind me. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, my heart racing like it might burst. I drove as fast as I could, eyes locked on the road ahead. When I finally dared to look back, the church was gone, just empty fields stretching into the void. I never went back. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard. All I know is that some places aren't meant to be revisited. Some places leave you changed, and some places never really leave at all. It was a quiet evening at home, the kind where the city seems to slow down, and all I could hear was the distant hum of cars passing by. The apartment building where I lived was old, with creaky floorboards and thin walls. I lived on the 4th floor, in a corner unit with windows that looked out over a row of old, weathered rooftops. I was sitting on the couch, engrossed in a book, when I heard the soft, repetitive tapping at my window. At first, I assumed it was just the wind, but when I glanced up, I realized there was no wind. It was perfectly still outside. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. I hesitated, my stomach twisting in knots. The apartment felt too quiet now, too still. I didn't want to move, but curiosity got the better of me. I stood slowly, tiptoeing toward the window. I pressed my face to the glass. Below me, in the alley between buildings, there was a figure. It stood completely still, staring up at my window. At first, I couldn't make out much. It was dark, and my view wasn't clear. But then, the figure moved closer, shuffling forward in a slow, unnatural way. Its movements were mechanical, jerky, as if it wasn't fully human. Panic set in as I realized its face was partially obscured, but I could still see the eyes. Empty, hollow, and void of life. They seemed to stare right through me, past the glass. I took a step back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping stopped. Silence followed except for my own breathing. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where the figure had been. Nothing moved, no sounds from outside. I didn't dare turn away from the window. Minutes passed, but the figure didn't move again. I was about to force myself to look away when, suddenly, the lights flickered. The entire room went dark for a brief second, and when they came back on, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. It was supposed to be a simple trip. A group of friends and I decided to spend the day at the lake, looking forward to some sun, swimming, and grilling burgers. We had rented a small cabin by the water, tucked away from the main shore, surrounded by tall trees. The plan was to relax and enjoy the quiet, but things quickly went south. We arrived early in the morning, and the place was exactly as we'd pictured: peaceful, remote, far from the noise of civilization. We set up camp near the lake, took out the boats, and spent the first half of the day swimming and joking around. The water was cool and refreshing, and we all felt content. Around midday, we decided to take a hike along the trail that followed the shoreline. The trees stretched high above us, casting long shadows over the dirt path. We walked for about an hour, laughing and pointing out strange-looking rocks or trees that had been twisted by the wind. It was nice, peaceful even. That's when it happened. We came across an old, weathered sign that pointed off the trail. "No trespassing," it read. We hesitated for a moment, unsure if we should follow it. Curiosity got the better of us, and one of us, the bravest, or perhaps the most reckless, led the way. The trail disappeared into thick undergrowth. The trees grew closer together, blocking out most of the sunlight. It was eerily quiet now, with only the faint rustling of leaves as the wind shifted. We walked for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing down on us. Suddenly, we stopped. The trail ended abruptly in front of us, but it wasn't just a dead end. It was as if something had been cleared away, as though we weren't meant to go any further. The ground was packed hard, with claw marks etched into the earth as if something had been dragged through there. My stomach twisted at the sight. We turned back, uneasy now. As we retraced our steps, we realized the forest felt wrong. The air was thick, colder somehow, and the silence was oppressive. I could hear my friends breathing, each breath sharp and shallow. The usual sounds of birds and insects had vanished. When we made it back to the lake, the cabin was still in sight, but something had changed. The sunlight seemed dimmer, the air colder. It wasn't until we were nearly back that we noticed it. Someone had followed us. At first, I thought it was just one of our own shadows, but when I turned to glance behind us, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, far away but clear enough to make out. It wasn't moving, just watching. We didn't speak. We just bolted toward the cabin, leaving the figure behind. Inside, we locked all the doors and windows, hearts racing. We tried to convince ourselves it was just someone from a neighboring cabin, maybe a hiker who had wandered off trail. But deep down, we knew better. The figure had been watching us, waiting. The rest of the day passed in a blur of silence and paranoia. We didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin made us jump. We knew whatever had followed us was still out there, waiting in the dark. By morning, the figure was gone, but the fear remained. Whatever had followed us wasn't human, or at least not anymore. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon when I decided to go for a drive. I had been feeling restless lately, and the open road seemed like the perfect escape. I grabbed my keys, jumped into my car, and drove aimlessly, taking whatever turns felt right. Eventually, I found myself deep in the countryside, miles from any sign of civilization. The roads twisted and turned, surrounded by nothing but trees and fields. The further I drove, the quieter it became. No cars, no people, just the hum of the engine and the distant chirp of birds. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. After a while, I came across an old farmhouse. Its paint was peeling and the windows were dark and empty. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pulled up beside the house, parking a little ways off the dusty driveway. I sat there for a moment, staring at the abandoned building. There was something unsettling about it, something that didn't sit right. I decided to get out and take a closer look. The wooden porch creaked under my feet as I approached the front door. Dust and cobwebs covered every surface. The house smelled old, like something had been left to rot inside. My breath fogged up the cracked window and I peered inside. It was empty, completely stripped of life. Chairs lay overturned, curtains torn and hanging in tatters. It was as if the house had been waiting for someone to return. As I wandered through the house, a strange feeling settled over me. The air was still, almost too still. It felt as if I wasn't alone. My skin crawled, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I called out, but no answer came. It was like the world had gone silent, the kind of silence that feels oppressive, as if something is breathing just beyond it. Upstairs, I found a room at the end of a narrow hallway. The door was slightly ajar, creaking when I pushed it open. Inside, the room was filled with faded furniture and more cobwebs. On the wall was a single photograph, worn and faded, its edges curling up. A family stood there, smiling, though their eyes seemed hollow, their grins fake. The photo sent a chill down my spine. Then I heard a sound from below, a faint, distant thud. My heart skipped a beat. I listened, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was walking through the house. I stood frozen, listening. The footsteps came from downstairs, echoing up the creaking staircase. I should have run, I knew that, but my legs wouldn't move. The fear had paralyzed me. Then I heard it, the sound of something else, a faint whispering voice. I couldn't make out the words, just the soft murmur as if someone was speaking in another language. It came from below, growing louder, as if whatever it was had found its way into the house. Tears filled my eyes as I forced myself to move. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to go back to the front door. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I moved slowly down the stairs, each creak beneath my feet sounding louder than the last. At the front door, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I had never been more afraid in my life. The whispers had grown so loud, they felt like they were in my head. I turned the knob, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the daylight. The house looked different from the outside, somehow darker, more twisted. I expected to see someone standing there watching me, but there was nothing, just the empty fields stretching out before me. The whispering faded, and the silence returned. I drove away without looking back. The house stayed with me, though. The image of that photograph, the whispering voice, it all felt too real. I don't know what I experienced that day, and I don't want to know. Some things are better left unexplained. The night had been uneventful at first. I had decided to take a long drive along the old highway that cut through the desolate plains. It wasn't a particularly scenic route, just endless stretches of cracked pavement and empty fields, stretching far beyond what the eye could see. The only light came from my headlights and the occasional flicker of my dashboard. The quiet was almost oppressive. I usually enjoyed solitude, but this felt different, more isolated, more oppressive. As I drove, I kept glancing at my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the headlights of another vehicle trailing behind. But there was nothing. No other cars, no signs of life. Just the endless road and the hum of my engine. It wasn't until I reached a stretch of road where the horizon curved slightly that something caught my attention. Off to the side, barely visible beneath a thick layer of dust and fog, was an old gas station. I couldn't recall ever seeing it before, but something about it made me slow down. The building was worn, paint peeling, and the sign above it flickered weakly in the night. I decided to stop. It wasn't as if I had much else to do. My phone had lost a signal hours ago and the gas gauge was hovering near empty. Pulling into the station, I cut the engine and stepped out into the stillness. The air was colder than I expected, biting at my skin as I stretched. The station looked abandoned. Cobwebs clung to the windows, and the front door creaked ominously when I pushed it open. Inside, everything was coated in dust. The aisles were empty, shelves leaning precariously, and there was a heavy silence that pressed down on me. I checked the register. Empty. The shelves were stocked, but there wasn't a single item that looked untouched in decades. My footsteps echoed as I wandered further inside, drawn by a sense of curiosity mixed with unease. That's when I heard it, the faintest sound, like a whisper on the edge of hearing. I stopped, my breath hitching. The noise wasn't coming from inside. It was outside, near the side of the building, like someone was dragging something heavy across the gravel. I moved toward the door and cracked it open. Nothing but the dark stretch of road and the fog that clung to the horizon. My heart thumped harder, and I stepped back inside, telling myself it was probably just my imagination. But then, I heard it again, closer this time. A dragging sound, slower, heavier. I didn't dare go outside, but I stood frozen, waiting for whatever it was to come into view. The noise stopped, as if whatever had been making it had reached the edge of the building, and then silence again. I forced myself to move, back toward the register. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, trying to reconnect to any signal, but the screen stayed blank. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was still watching. I had almost convinced myself to leave when I heard a voice. Soft. Low. Hello? My stomach twisted. It wasn't like any human voice I'd ever heard. Hollow, distorted, as though the words had been dragged through something sinister. I backed further into the station, heart racing. "Who's there?" I called, but my voice shook. The silence stretched. Then came the whisper again, closer. "Why are you here?" I didn't have an answer. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe someone was playing some kind of cruel prank. Or maybe I was losing my mind. But there was no way to rationalize what was happening. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the fog, moving with an unnatural gait. Its limbs were too long, bent at angles they shouldn't have been. Its face was shadowed, but I could see eyes, dark, hollow pits where the light should have been. I stumbled backward, knocking into a shelf. "No! No!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The thing didn't respond. It continued to move toward me, silent but relentless. Desperation set in. I didn't think, I just ran, back toward the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I shoved the door open, not even bothering to check behind me. The fog outside was thicker now, swallowing the road, the station, everything. I sprinted, not caring where I was going, only knowing I couldn't stay there. My legs burned, but I didn't stop, didn't look back, not until I found my car and jumped inside. When I glanced in the rear-view mirror, there was nothing there, just the road, stretching on endlessly. But I knew whatever had followed me, whatever had been waiting in the shadows of that gas station, wasn't gone. It was still out there, and it wouldn't stop. It was late summer, and I'd gone on a solo camping trip, something I hadn't done in years. My usual companions had fallen through, but I felt an odd pull to get away from everything and find some peace in the quiet of the wilderness. I chose a remote spot deep in the forest, far from any trails or campsites. I wanted isolation, and I got it. The first day was perfect. The forest stretched out in every direction, vast and untouched. I set up my tent near a small stream, and the sound of running water helped calm my restless mind. There were no signs of other people, no other sounds except for the occasional rustling of leaves and birdsong. That night, as I sat by the fire, I thought about how peaceful it all felt. I'd grown so used to the noise of city life, and now, surrounded by nothing but nature, it was like the world had slowed down. I didn't feel the usual anxiety or stress that had followed me in recent months, but as I lay in my tent, drifting off to sleep, I was suddenly jolted awake. Something had rustled outside. I sat up, listening intently. The forest was still, save for the sound of my own heartbeat. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was near. The night passed in silence after that. I convinced myself it was just my nerves. The forest can play tricks on you, and my overactive imagination was likely running wild. By morning, I was ready to forget the incident. But as I broke camp, I noticed something strange. Around my tent, the ground was uneven, disturbed. It looked like something heavy had walked through during the night, leaving deep, uneven prints. I followed the trail they made, huge, unnatural footprints that seemed to lead away from the stream and deeper into the woods. I told myself it was probably an animal. Bears roamed these parts, sure, but the tracks were larger than anything I'd ever seen before. They were too large, the stride too long. I tried to brush it off as fatigue playing tricks on me. That afternoon, as I ventured further into the forest, something shifted. The usual sounds of the woods, birds chirping, leaves rustling, became distant, faint. The silence returned, but this time, it was more oppressive. It felt as though the forest was holding its breath. I stopped walking and listened. There was nothing. No breeze, no distant rustling. Just silence. A sudden chill ran down my spine as I realized how alone I was. At first, I thought of turning back, but something kept pulling me forward. Curiosity, maybe, or the strange feeling that I wasn't truly alone. Against my better judgment, I pressed on, deeper into the woods, following the trail of those strange footprints. I don't know how long I walked, lost in thought and the eerie stillness of the forest. Suddenly, I stumbled upon a clearing, one that had no right to be there. It wasn't a natural formation, but rather it felt carved out. The trees surrounding it stood unnaturally still, their branches twisting toward the ground as if weighed down by unseen forces. In the center of the clearing stood something I can't fully explain. It was humanoid, though not human. Its form was obscured, shadowy and indistinct, like it was made of fog. I could barely make out its shape, but its presence felt palpable, almost suffocating. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared at it, unsure if I was still dreaming or if this was something real. The creature, if that's what it was, turned its head slowly in my direction. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze on me. Cold, empty, and infinite. Something in its presence made my skin crawl. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. It felt like I was frozen, trapped in its gaze. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The clearing was empty once more, as though it had never been there at all. I turned and stumbled back, not sure how far I had come. My mind was racing, the sound of my own footsteps echoing through the silent forest. Every step felt heavier, like I was being followed, though I didn't dare look back. By the time I reached my tent, I didn't stop. I packed everything in a daze and left, not looking back at the deep woods that had become so foreign. I don't know what I saw that day. I've tried to convince myself it was just some trick of the mind, that the isolation and silence had gotten to me. But the footprints, they were real. The figure in the clearing, whatever it was real. I've never gone back to the woods since. It was the kind of evening where the sky seemed to press down on everything, as if it wanted to swallow the world whole. My friends and I had decided to take a drive out to the old abandoned lighthouse, miles from any town, where the cliffs stretched out over the ocean like they were reaching toward the sky itself. The lighthouse had been shut down decades ago, long before anyone could remember. We'd heard rumors that it was haunted, but we didn't believe in that kind of stuff. We just wanted an adventure. The road to get there was narrow, winding, and barely lit by a few flickering streetlights that flickered on and off like they were uncertain of their own purpose. We parked the car at the base of the cliffs and began walking toward the lighthouse. The air smelled of salt and decay, the kind of place where you feel like you've stepped out of time. The lighthouse stood there, looming and skeletal against the darkening sky. Its red brick tower stood like a sentinel, long forgotten, its windows cracked and covered in moss. We reached the entrance, a heavy metal door that creaked open with a groan. Inside, everything was covered in dust. The old lanterns hung from the walls, cobwebs stretched between them. The faint smell of mildew and dampness clung to everything. We walked up the narrow staircase, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The higher we climbed, the darker it got. The dim light from the lanterns barely illuminated our path. I kept expecting to hear something. Footsteps, whispers, or maybe the creak of an old floorboard. Something to break the silence. But all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick, and the soft shuffle of my friends behind me. Finally, we reached the top. The door at the top of the staircase creaked open, and we stepped out onto the balcony of the lighthouse. The wind hit us, sharp and cold, as we looked out over the cliffs. The ocean stretched out endlessly beneath us. The waves crashed far below, their roar distant and faint. The horizon stretched into nothingness, the darkness blending with the sea. We stood there, taking in the view, laughing and joking. We were miles from civilization, miles from anything that could disturb us. Or so we thought. That's when I heard it. The soft scraping sound, like something dragging itself across the floor below us. I turned to my friends, but they didn't seem to hear it. I figured it was the wind, some old creaking of the lighthouse settling into the darkness. But then it came again, louder, more deliberate. This time, it wasn't below us. It was above. I froze, staring up toward the narrow spiral staircase that led to the top of the tower. The scraping noise was now followed by the faint sound of ragged breathing, labored and slow, like something struggling to draw in air. My hands trembled as I pointed upward. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, but my voice was lost in the wind. My friends looked at me, puzzled. I swallowed hard, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on my mind. But then came the unmistakable sound of a voice, low and cracked, whispering something I couldn't make out. We were alone up there. I knew it. The others insisted it was probably the wind or some animal, but my instincts told me otherwise. I grabbed my friend's arm and whispered, "We need to get out of here." We turned, bolting down the staircase as fast as we could, the sound of our footsteps pounding in our ears. The scraping noise followed us, but it was closer now, louder. It sounded like it was climbing after us. When we reached the base of the tower, the door was still open. But what we saw outside wasn't normal. There was something standing by the car, something too tall, too thin, with its back bent unnaturally. It didn't move like a person. It was more like a shadow, stretching toward us in the dim light. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow, dark, and seemed to burn with a cold, inhuman light. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. The others were frozen in place, too terrified to move. The figure turned its head slowly as if observing us, and then started to walk toward us. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it wasn't sure what it wanted. Without thinking, we bolted down the cliffside, the figure still behind us. The wind howled louder, but we didn't stop. We didn't stop until we reached the car and drove away, not looking back. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. I haven't been able to go near that lighthouse since. Whatever was up there, waiting for us, still lingers in my mind. Some places, I've learned, are better left untouched. It was late at night, and I was driving home from a family gathering. The roads were mostly empty, the only sound being the occasional hum of my tires on the asphalt. I wasn't particularly familiar with this route. My usual path was blocked off due to some road work, but it was the quickest detour I could take. As I drove deeper into the countryside, the landscape changed. The city lights faded behind me, leaving only dark fields and dense trees. The silence grew oppressive. I had this strange feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, but I brushed it off, convincing myself I was imagining things. About 20 minutes into the detour, I passed a small, ancient-looking church. Its steeple pierced through the night sky, its silhouette standing stark against the dim moonlight. The church looked abandoned, with vines creeping up its sides, and the windows were shattered, filled with dirt and cobwebs. I shivered despite the warm breeze. As I drove by, my headlights briefly illuminated the graveyard surrounding the church. Tombstones leaned at odd angles, some half buried in the earth. The whole scene felt eerily still, like it wasn't part of this world. I tried to shake the unease that settled in my stomach and pressed on, telling myself it was just an old church. It was the next turn that unnerved me. The road curved sharply into a dense forest. The trees loomed high, their branches interlocking like dark claws above me. The air grew colder, and I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. My headlights barely cut through the fog that had begun to roll in. I slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The feeling that I was being watched grew stronger. I kept telling myself I was overthinking things, but my pulse quickened with each passing second. Then I heard it, faint but unmistakable. A low, hollow whispering. It was so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it, but it repeated, clear as day. Follow. I froze. The whisper wasn't coming from inside the car. It seemed to be carried on the wind, drifting from the trees around me. My fingers went numb as I clutched the steering wheel tighter. I scanned the forest, searching for the source, but the trees were motionless, their shadows stretching endlessly. Follow. This time, it was closer. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to drive away, but my foot wouldn't move. I didn't know if it was fear or something else keeping me there. Suddenly, my headlights flickered. The noise of the engine seemed to fade into the whispering. I could barely hear the tires on the road beneath me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible through the thick fog. Its outline was dark and impossibly tall. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I should have turned around then, should have left, but my body felt paralyzed. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. Follow. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Without thinking, I found myself inching the car forward, the figure still staring, unmoving. It was like it was beckoning me, luring me deeper into the unknown. I don't know how long I drove. The road twisted and turned, every mile feeling longer than the last. The whisper didn't stop, growing louder, as if I were being led deeper into the woods, into whatever nightmare lurked ahead. Finally, the whisper faded. The trees grew thinner. The fog cleared slightly, and I found myself driving onto a dirt path. Ahead of me was a clearing, bathed in moonlight. In the center stood the church, its shattered windows now gleaming with an otherworldly glow. My heart pounded as I realized the figure was gone. I hesitated, my hands still gripping the wheel, but something compelled me to stop. I didn't know why. My legs felt like they were moving on their own. I stepped out of the car, the ground beneath my feet cold and wet. I approached the church, the whisper now replaced by silence. My footsteps echoed in the stillness. When I reached the church, I stared at the cracked entrance, frozen with fear. But there was nothing. No figure, no whispers, no voices, just an old, abandoned church standing in the cold, dead night. And as I turned to leave, I realized the face I had seen in the cracked window wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone's. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip with a group of friends. We decided to take a hike through a dense, unfamiliar forest. No cabins, no gas stations, just trees and nature for miles. I wasn't the outdoorsy type, but something about getting away from the city's chaos sounded appealing. We parked at a trailhead that felt like it hadn't seen visitors in years. The road was overgrown, and the air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Our group of 5 took our first steps into the forest, the sunlight filtering through the canopy above. It was peaceful, serene, or so I thought. About an hour into the hike, things began to feel off. The path we'd been following seemed to narrow, the trees closing in around us. We'd all become quiet, unsure if we were heading the right way. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, distant birds, had fallen silent. It was like we were walking through some uncharted, forgotten place. "Are we even on the trail anymore?" one of my friends asked, her voice uncertain. I stopped and looked around. The trees were so thick, and the sunlight barely broke through. It felt unnatural. But before I could suggest turning back, we noticed something strange. A figure, just a glimpse, moving deeper into the woods. "Did anyone else see that?" someone whispered, their voice barely audible. We all exchanged uneasy glances. The figure had been too tall, too dark. None of us could make out its features, but we could feel its presence. It didn't belong in these woods. "We should follow it," someone said, their voice shaking. Reluctantly, we pressed on. The deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. The forest seemed to shift, twisting into something darker. The trees grew taller, the air growing colder. Every step felt heavier, as if the very ground beneath us was resisting our presence. Hours passed, or so it felt. The light grew dim, the woods silent except for the crunch of our footsteps. The figure was always just out of sight, moving further away. We wanted to call out, to demand answers, but our voices felt frozen in our throats. Suddenly, one of my friends stopped walking, their face pale. Where did everyone go?" they whispered. I spun around. The others had vanished. No trace, no sound. Just me and the forest. My heart began to pound in my chest as I realized I was alone, surrounded by trees that felt alive. I called out, but there was no response. My friends had disappeared, and the silence returned. I wandered aimlessly, trying to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to shift with every attempt. It felt like the trees were closing in on me, squeezing me tighter. Then I heard it, a faint whispering. Voices, but not human. They sounded hollow, like they were echoing from the very woods themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was haunting, sorrowful. I tried to run, but my legs gave out, the ground beneath me uneven and slippery. As I struggled to my feet, I saw the figure again. This time it was closer, taller, more menacing. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light, watching me with a dead, hollow stare. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, waiting. I felt something brush against my arm, a cold, bony touch that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to fight back, but whatever was out there was far beyond anything I could comprehend. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. For what felt like hours, I wandered through the woods, not knowing if I was even going in the right direction. I couldn't hear any of my friends, but I knew they couldn't have gone far. The whispering voices persisted, growing louder, more desperate. Finally, I broke through the trees and saw the trailhead, familiar now. The sun was rising, casting long shadows on the ground. My friends were gone, but the figure was nowhere to be seen. I made my way back to the car, breathless and shaken. The forest remained quiet, the eerie calm settling over me like a shroud. My friends were never found. To this day, I've never been able to explain what happened. The woods had taken them, and they took part of me with them, too. It was supposed to be a relaxing trip. My friends and I decided to rent a small, secluded cabin by a quiet lake in the mountains. No phones, no internet, just nature and us, looking to escape the city for a few days. I wasn't expecting much, just peace and quiet, maybe a few beers by the fire. The cabin was far off the beaten path, accessible only by a narrow dirt road winding through the forest. We arrived at sunset, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. The cabin itself was old but charming, built from rough timber and surrounded by tall trees. It felt like the perfect escape. That first night, everything was peaceful. We unpacked, built a fire, and enjoyed the stillness of the night. The only sounds were the crackling flames and the occasional rustle of the trees in the breeze. After a few hours, we turned in, exhausted from the long drive. I awoke sometime later. The cabin was quiet, but there was a faint noise that drew me from my sleep. A soft, thudding sound like someone knocking just outside the window. I sat up, my heart pounding. The window was shuttered, but the sound grew louder as if someone was knocking again and again, faster now. I didn't want to believe it, but the thudding was rhythmic, persistent, and coming from right outside. The others were fast asleep, unaware, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread creeping up my spine. I stayed perfectly still, listening, as the sound became louder, more frantic, then silence. My breath caught in my throat as I waited, straining to hear any movement outside. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the night. In the morning, I told my friends about the noise, but they brushed it off. Probably just an animal, they said. I wanted to believe that, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. That afternoon, we decided to go for a hike along one of the trails nearby. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, but there was nothing behind us, just the endless trees and the winding trail. Still, the sense of unease persisted. When we returned to the cabin, something felt different. The air was thicker, the silence more oppressive. That night, as we gathered around the fire, I noticed something strange. The fire flickered unnaturally, casting distorted shadows on the walls. I kept thinking about the knocking I heard, wondering if whatever made that sound had followed us. We decided to turn in early, and once again, I awoke in the middle of the night, this time to the sound of faint whispering. It was soft, almost drowned out by the rustling trees outside, but it was there. I sat up, listening intently, trying to make out what was being said, but the words were indistinct, like they were carried away by the wind. I couldn't move. The whispering grew louder, clearer, until I could almost make out what they were saying. And then it stopped. Just like before, the silence returned. The next morning, I woke to find a dark smear on the window, the same window that had the shutter knocked on the night before. I wasn't sure what it was. It looked like something had pressed itself against the glass, leaving a mark that wouldn't wipe away. That day, my friends decided to leave. I wanted to stay, but the fear of what had been outside was too much to ignore. As we packed the car, I couldn't help but glance back at the cabin one last time. The woods were silent as they had always been, but I knew I wasn't alone. The knocking was still out there, waiting. The first time I saw the figure, I was hiking alone. The trail cut through a remote mountain range miles from the nearest town. I decided to spend the weekend camping, seeking peace away from the noise of civilization. It was supposed to be a break from everything, but what I found instead was something I couldn't explain. The morning started off perfect. The air was crisp, the trees towering above me, their leaves whispering in the wind. I made my way up the trail, taking my time, savoring the silence. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the faint calls of distant birds. I reached a clearing near midday, a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley below. It was breathtaking, serene, untouched by modern life. I took a deep breath, sitting down to eat my lunch. That's when I noticed him. A man, standing far in the distance at the edge of the forest. His figure was oddly still, almost too still. He wasn't moving, just watching me. At first, I thought it might be someone else, another hiker perhaps. But the longer I stared, the more I realized how unnatural his stillness was. His head tilted slightly, as if studying me. There was no wave, no acknowledgement, just stillness. I packed up my things, keeping an eye on him. I told myself I was imagining things. The wind must have carried a shadow, or maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The rest of the hike was uneventful. I set up camp near a small lake, the sun dipping below the horizon as I started a fire. That night, as I lay staring up at the stars, I couldn't help but think of the figure. Was he still there, watching me from the forest's edge? I wanted to dismiss the thought, but the longer I sat in silence, the more real it felt. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of something outside my tent, a soft rustling. My heart jumped, and I held my breath, straining to listen. There was no wind now, no rustling of leaves, just stillness. But the noise continued. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking toward my tent. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it toward the entrance. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Silence. I slowly unzipped the tent, heart pounding in my chest. The campsite was still, empty. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I had no idea what I expected to find, but the sense of someone, or something, out there lingered in my mind. In the morning light, I checked the area thoroughly, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no tracks, nothing to suggest I wasn't alone. I felt the weight of unease settling deep into my bones, but I packed up and continued my hike, telling myself the encounter was nothing more than paranoia. It wasn't until I returned home that I realized something was missing from my pack, one of my water bottles. I searched through my gear, retracing my steps in my mind. The bottle had been full that morning, yet now it was gone. I don't know how it vanished. I know I would have noticed if I had lost it along the trail. The bottle was one of my last few. Water wasn't plentiful out there, and yet it was gone. I've never returned to those mountains. The memory of that figure, still and silent, watching from the trees, stays with me. I can still feel his eyes on me, even now, long after I've left the wilderness behind. It was a late afternoon when I decided to take a walk through the old neighborhood. The sun was casting long shadows over the cracked sidewalks, and the air was thick with the smell of old wood and rust. This wasn't a place I usually visited. It had been abandoned years ago. Most of the houses were overgrown, their windows dark and the streets devoid of life. It was the kind of place where time had seemingly stopped. As I wandered further down the quiet, forgotten streets, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant creak of old fences swaying in the wind. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the stillness of the place playing tricks on me. But then I saw it. At first, only a shadow, but as I turned a corner, I froze. A figure was standing at the end of the street, barely visible against the fading light. It was tall, too tall, and its features were obscured by the deep shadows of dusk. I stood there, heart pounding, unsure of what to do. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. My first instinct was to turn and run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I told myself it was just someone lost, wandering through the old neighborhood like I was. Maybe they didn't know where they were either. But the way they stared at me, so still, so unnerving, made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't ignore. I forced my legs to move, taking slow, cautious steps toward the figure. As I got closer, I realized that there was something off about them. They didn't seem human. There was an unnatural stillness to their posture, as if they were frozen in place. And their eyes, they weren't reflecting any light, just pure, empty voids. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My throat was dry, and my mind felt clouded with fear. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying me, and then took a step forward. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like it didn't belong in this world. I stumbled back, my breath hitching. This wasn't human. It couldn't be. I turned and ran, sprinting as fast as I could, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't dare look behind me. I just kept running, fueled by pure panic. The sounds of my footsteps echoed off the empty streets, but no other sounds followed. No wind, no birds, no distant cars. Just silence. The kind of silence that feels alive, watching. When I finally stopped, I was out of breath, my chest heaving. I stood there trying to gather my wits, but the eerie quiet of the neighborhood felt thicker than before. I dared to glance back, but the figure was gone. There was no trace of them, just the empty street stretching before me. I didn't go back into that neighborhood. I never will. Whatever it was, whatever I saw, I know I wasn't supposed to.
But the wind didn't make whispers like that soft, almost melodic, as if they were calling to me. When we reached the bottom of the trail, I was relieved to be back on solid ground. But as we were walking back to our car, something stopped me. I glanced back toward the lighthouse, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement. At the top of the stairs. Just for a split second, I saw a figure, a silhouette. It wasn't solid, more like a shadow against the fading light. It seemed to be watching us, standing perfectly still. My stomach twisted, and I called out to my friends, but they were already too far ahead. By the time they turned back, there was nothing there. I didn't sleep that night. Even now, weeks later, I still hear the whispers, sometimes faint and distant, like they're always just beyond my reach. The lighthouse may be gone, but whatever it is that watched us from the top, it's still out there. The stairs spiraled up the side of the cliff, worn and partially collapsed, but we made it to the top without much difficulty. The view was breathtaking, the vast expanse of ocean stretching out endlessly beneath us. We felt like we were on top of the world. As we explored the interior of the lighthouse, I noticed something strange. It wasn't just the cracked and broken furniture or the dust-covered rooms. There was an overwhelming sense of stillness. The air felt thick, and it seemed like the walls were watching us. It was then that we heard it, a faint, echoing sound, as though someone was whispering from far away. I stood still, straining my ears, trying to make sense of the noise. My friends didn't seem to notice, too busy taking pictures of the breathtaking view. "Did you hear that?" I asked, but no one seemed to respond. They brushed it off, assuming I was imagining things. But the sound wasn't just in my head, it was real, persistent, and getting louder. As we made our way back down, the whispers continued, growing louder, more distinct. I tried to keep calm, convinced that it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but the wind didn't make whispers like that, soft, almost melodic, as if they were calling to me. When we reached the bottom of the trail, I was relieved to be back on solid ground. But as we were walking back to our car, something stopped me. I glanced back toward the lighthouse, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement. At the top of the stairs. Just for a split second, I saw a figure, a silhouette. It wasn't solid, more like a shadow against the fading light. It seemed to be watching us, standing perfectly still. My stomach twisted, and I called out to my friends, but they were already too far ahead. By the time they turned back, there was nothing there. I didn't sleep that night. Even now, weeks later, I still hear the whispers, sometimes faint and distant, like they're always just beyond my reach. The lighthouse may be gone, but whatever it is that watched us from the top, it's still out there. And yet, I felt drawn to them, as though they were speaking directly to me. The whispers were no longer whispers. They had become a chorus of voices, chanting and echoing through the room. I could hear them clearly now, clear as if they were standing beside me. In that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. I slammed the book shut, my mind racing. The whispers faded, but the feeling of being watched didn't. I grabbed the nearest light and ran. Back to the store, back to the exit, not daring to look behind me. As I reached the front door, I heard it, the same tapping sound, closer than before. I didn't stop to turn around. I just ran, faster than I ever thought possible, until I burst out into the night, gasping for air. The bookstore was still behind me, standing in the silence of the empty street. And though I couldn't hear the whispers anymore, I knew they were there waiting, lurking in the shadows, always watching. I never went back, and I hope I never will. The windows were dust-coated, and the only sound was the occasional tick of the clock. That night, I arrived, greeted by the dull hum of the ceiling fan. The store was more of a maze than anything else, filled with narrow aisles and towering stacks of books. It was strangely peaceful, and for the first couple of hours, I enjoyed the quiet, keeping myself busy restocking shelves, straightening books, and tidying up. But as the hours passed, the atmosphere began to shift. It started with a faint whisper, just at the edge of my hearing. I froze, listening intently, but there was nothing there. I dismissed it as the creaking of the old building. My pulse quickened, and I gripped the counter, trying to calm myself. It's nothing, I told myself, but the whispers didn't stop. They weren't just echoes, they were something else, something wrong. They weren't meant to be there. I checked my phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, there wouldn't be. I was miles away from civilization, with only the dark streets outside and the abandoned bookstore around me. Then, I heard a soft tapping, coming from deep within the store. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing louder with each step. The whispers seemed to grow louder, circling me, as though they were drawing me in. At the end of a dimly lit aisle, I found a small door tucked behind a shelf of old, dusty novels. My pulse quickened, and I gripped the counter, trying to calm myself. It's nothing, I told myself, but the whispers didn't stop. They weren't just echoes, they were something else, something wrong. They weren't meant to be there. I checked my phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, there wouldn't be. I was miles away from civilization, with only the dark streets outside and the abandoned bookstore around me. Then, I heard a soft tapping, coming from deep within the store. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing louder with each step. The whispers seemed to grow louder, circling me, as though they were drawing me in. At the end of a dimly lit aisle, I found a small door tucked behind a shelf of old, dusty novels. I hesitated, heart thudding in my chest. My breath came quicker as I pushed the door open slowly. Inside, it was cold or freezing. In fact, the whispers filled the air, louder and clearer now. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were words. Words I couldn't make out, but they sounded like they were murmuring to me, calling me. I stepped further inside. The room was filled with books, hundreds, thousands of them, but they were unlike any I'd seen before. The spines were cracked, the pages yellowed with age, covered in symbols and strange, unreadable scripts. Some seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light, as if they had their own pulse, their own life. One book caught my eye larger than the rest, almost glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, and opened it. The words inside weren't just text. They weren't words at all. They were something else, symbols, patterns, things I couldn't comprehend, and yet I felt drawn to them as though they were speaking directly to me. The whispers were no longer whispers. They had become a chorus of voices, chanting and echoing through the room. I could hear them clearly now, clear as if they were standing beside me. In that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. I slammed the book shut, my mind racing. The whispers faded, but the feeling of being watched didn't. I grabbed the nearest light and ran. Back to the store, back to the exit, not daring to look behind me. As I reached the front door, I heard it, the same tapping sound, closer than before. I didn't stop to turn around. I just ran, faster than I ever thought possible, until I burst out into the night, gasping for air. The bookstore was still behind me, standing in the silence of the empty street. And though I couldn't hear the whispers anymore, I knew they were there waiting, lurking in the shadows, always watching. I never went back, and I hope I never will. The old house at the edge of town had been abandoned for years, its peeling paint and sagging roof a grim testament to better days. My friends and I dared each other to go inside on Halloween night, convinced the tales of the ghostly woman in black were stories meant to scare children. The moon was full, casting a pale glow on the cracked pavement as we approached the house. The air was chilly, and a strange stillness hung over the neighborhood, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your heart thump louder. We pushed open the front door, the wood groaning in protest, and stepped into the darkness. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with the scent of mildew. Dust coated the floorboards, and spider webs draped the corners like sinister lace. The old house at the edge of town had been abandoned for years, its peeling paint and sagging roof a grim testament to better days. My friends and I dared each other to go inside on Halloween night, convinced the tales of the ghostly woman in black were stories meant to scare children. The moon was full, casting a pale glow on the cracked pavement as we approached the house. The air was chilly, and a strange stillness hung over the neighborhood, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your heart thump louder. We pushed open the front door, the wood groaning in protest, and stepped into the darkness. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with the scent of mildew. Dust coated the floorboards, and spider webs draped the corners like sinister lace. My friends froze, eyes wide and breaths caught in their throats. We exchanged nervous glances, and then the giggle came again, this time closer. The floorboards creaked behind us, and we spun around to see a shadow at the end of the hall. It moved, quick and fluid, vanishing into a dark doorway. Without thinking, I started after it. The others shouted for me to stop, but I didn't listen. My feet carried me down the hallway, past faded portraits with eyes that seemed to follow me, until I reached the doorway. The room was dark, but a small, flickering candle on the floor cast a dancing light across the walls. It was surrounded by torn papers and strange markings, like some kind of ritualistic symbols. My flashlight caught a glimpse of something in the corner. It was a child's doll, its porcelain face cracked and stained with what looked like dirt or something worse. The giggle returned, this time louder, and I spun around, heart racing. A woman stood in the doorway, her face obscured by a black veil. The air thickened, heavy and suffocating, and my flashlight flickered. The woman reached out, her fingers thin and gnarled, with nails as sharp as broken glass. I stumbled backward, but the floor caught my foot, and I fell hard against the wall. The others burst into the room, their eyes wide with terror. The woman didn't move. She simply stood there, staring at us with eyes that seemed to bleed from behind the veil. Then, suddenly, The candle blew out, plunging us into darkness. I heard shuffling, quick footsteps, and then a loud thud. My flashlight flickered back on, revealing the others scrambling to their feet, panting and terrified, but the woman was gone. We ran out of the house, the front door slamming shut behind us as if held by an unseen hand. We stood there, breathless and shaking, staring at the old, creaking house. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. As we looked around, I noticed something horrifying. The window of the ballroom was wide open, and staring back at us was the child's doll, its cracked porcelain face split into an unsettling smile. We never went back. But sometimes, when the moon is full and the wind howls just right, I swear I hear that giggle, soft and echoing, from somewhere in the dark. I didn't tell them that I had heard its voice, a voice that whispered my name in a voice I recognized. The voice of someone I had known a long time ago. It wasn't until weeks later, when I was walking home late at night, that I heard the thumping again. This time, it wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from behind me. Footsteps that were just too heavy to be human. I turned, but there was nothing there. The night was still, the crickets chirping as if nothing had happened. But the voice, that voice I knew so well, whispered again, just loud enough for me to hear. Not yet. I'm still waiting. I opened my mouth to say something when I heard a faint thumping sound, like distant drumming, coming from the forest. I tried to shake it off. It could have been an animal, I told myself, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound grew louder, the drumming turning into rhythmic, pounding thuds that seemed to match the beat of my heart. I felt a chill run through me as I looked over at the forest. It was hard to tell in the dark, but I thought I saw movement at the tree line. Shadows shifting just out of sight. Hey, did anyone else hear that? I asked, my voice wavering. My friends looked up, puzzled, but before anyone could respond, the thumping stopped. For a moment, there was only silence again, broken by the sound of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. But then, the silence shattered with a loud snap, a branch breaking, and then another, as if something large was moving through the forest. I tried to laugh it off, to tell myself it was just the wind, but my friends were no longer smiling. They were staring at the edge of the trees, eyes wide and breathless. What if it's a person? One of them whispered. Before I could reply, there was a sound that made my blood freeze, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from just behind the trees. It wasn't the sound of any animal I recognized. It was too deep, too alive. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the growl cut off, leaving an unbearable silence. We stood there, staring at each other, the chill of the night creeping into our bones. One of my friends, Tom, glanced over at the path leading back to the road. We should go, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We gathered our things and started walking quickly, our eyes flicking back to the forest every few steps. The thumping started up again, but this time it was closer. Each thud echoed behind us, heavier and more insistent. We picked up our pace, the sounds following us, pushing us forward like a terrible wind. I dared a quick glance back, and for a split second, I thought I saw something tall, darker than the night, with limbs that bent in unnatural ways. It was only there for an instant, then vanished back into the trees, but I could still feel its presence, a dark, hungry shadow just behind us. We made it back to the road, panting and terrified, but the sounds of the forest had stopped. There was no thumping, no growl, just the soft breeze rustling the grass. We didn't stop until we were safely in town, where streetlights cast a warm glow over the empty streets. As we talked about what had happened, we realized we had all seen something different. Tom swore he had seen a long, thin arm reaching for him. Sarah said she felt cold fingers brush her back as they passed the forest edge. I didn't tell them that I had heard its voice, a voice that whispered my name in a voice I recognized. The voice of someone I had known a long time ago. It wasn't until weeks later, when I was walking home late at night, that I heard the thumping again. This time, it wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from behind me. Footsteps that were just too heavy to be human. I turned, but there was nothing there. The night was still, the crickets chirping as if nothing had happened. But the voice, that voice I knew so well, whispered again, just loud enough for me to hear. Not yet. I'm still waiting. The evening sun dipped low, painting the sky in a wash of orange and pink as I stood in the middle of the field, staring out at the sprawling farm. The summer harvest was winding down, and I was finishing up my last task, picking a few late-season tomatoes. The air was warm but carried a faint, bitter tang that didn't sit right in my throat. I glanced around, trying to push the feeling aside. There was no reason for it. The farm was my sanctuary, a place where nothing could go wrong. I'd been working on my uncle's farm for years. It was familiar, predictable, and usually quiet except for the crows that would squawk and wheel in the sky. But tonight, something was different. The field behind the barn was where I always finished my day. I loved the rhythmic rustle of the tall corn stalks and the occasional cricket chirping, a sound that calmed me down after a long day. But today, the corn didn't move with the wind. It stood still, like it was holding its breath. I swallowed hard, feeling that strange, electric tingle creep up my spine. Hey, are you out there? My uncle's voice cut through the silence, startling me. I turned and saw him at the edge of the porch, the silhouette of his wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. I raised a hand to show I was still working, but then something caught my eye. Just beyond the corn, near the tree line, something moved. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it didn't move like one. It was too slow, too deliberate. I squinted, trying to see better, but the light was fading fast. That's when I saw an arm, pale and thin, poking out from between the stalks. It was just an arm, no body, no head, yet it seemed to be reaching for something, fingers twitching as though testing the air. A shiver passed through me, and I dropped my basket, the tomatoes rolling across the dirt. "Uncle," I called, my voice shaking. He was already running towards me, but he stopped when he saw the arm. His expression shifted from concern to confusion, and then to something else I couldn't name. His eyes widened, and he glanced toward the woods before meeting my gaze. "You need to get inside now," he said, his voice low and rough. Before I could ask why, the arm pulled back into the cornfield, and a wet, spluttering sound followed. It was as though something was dragging itself, the thud of its movements muffled by the earth. The corn rustled violently, then fell silent again, a suffocating hush settling over everything. My uncle grabbed my arm, pulling me towards the porch. "Inside," he said, more urgently this time, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot. A scream tore through the air, sharp and strangled. It wasn't human. It was like an animal, but worse, deeper, guttural. My body froze, but my mind raced, fighting the instinct to run. I glanced back toward the field, my uncle's grip digging into my arm. There, standing at the edge of the corn, was a figure. It was pale, emaciated, its limbs too long and crooked. It didn't have a face. Just a void where I should be, a black, empty space that seemed to pulse in the dim light. Then it moved, not toward us, but sideways, disappearing into the woods, the corn behind it shivering as it passed. I staggered back as the last light of the day slipped below the horizon. I swallowed hard, feeling that strange, electric tingle creep up my spine. "Hey, are you out there?" My uncle's voice cut through the silence, startling me. I turned and saw him at the edge of the porch, the silhouette of his wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. I raised a hand to show I was still working, but then something caught my eye. Just beyond the corn, near the tree line, something moved. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it didn't move like one. It was too slow, too deliberate. I squinted, trying to see better, but the light was fading fast. That's when I saw an arm, pale and thin, poking out from between the stalks. It was just an arm, no body, no head, yet it seemed to be reaching for something, fingers twitching as though testing the air. A shiver passed through me, and I dropped my basket, the tomatoes rolling across the dirt. Uncle. I had been driving for hours, taking the long way home from a visit to my grandparents. The farmland stretched out on either side of the road, a patchwork of fields that seemed to go on forever. With every turn, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that twisted like fingers reaching out to catch me. I was almost home when I noticed the old, rusted tractor sitting off to the side of the road. It hadn't been there before, and I found myself slowing down to take a closer look. The engine was covered in dirt, and weeds had grown up around its tires, like it had been abandoned years ago. I couldn't remember ever seeing it there, and I would have remembered, because I had driven down that road countless times. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if someone were watching me. I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a dark figure standing behind my car. The road was empty, and the fields were quiet except for the rustle of dry corn stalks in the wind. I scoffed at myself, muttering that I was being paranoid, and drove on. Just as I was about to turn onto my street, a strange noise caught my attention. It was a rhythmic thumping, like someone pounding on a hollow drum. I pulled to a stop, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The noise seemed to be coming from the field to my left, where the corn had grown tall and thick, forming an almost impenetrable wall. I stared into the dark expanse, my pulse quickening. The thumping was joined by an odd, gurgling sound, like water bubbling up through mud. A shiver raced down my spine as I realized the noise was moving, shifting closer to the road. I backed up a few feet, my eyes wide as I watched the edge of the field ripple like the surface of a pond. Then I saw it, a figure, distorted and half hidden by the corn stalks. It was tall, hunched, with limbs that bent in unnatural ways. Its head was tilted at an angle that made my stomach twist. I slammed the car into reverse and peeled away from the field, the thumping and gurgling growing louder behind me. My tires skidded as I spun around the corner and raced down my street. I didn't dare look back, but my rearview mirror showed the edge of the field, swaying as if something large had stepped into the road. My hands were shaking as I pulled into my driveway and jumped out, not waiting for the car to come to a complete stop. The front door creaked as I fumbled with my keys, barely managing to unlock it. I slammed the door shut behind me, pressing my back against it as my breath came in short, ragged gasps. The thumping had stopped, but now there was a new sound of scraping, as if something with long, sharp claws was dragging itself along the edge of the field. I peeked through the window, my heart leaping into my throat when I saw a shadow move past the porch light. It was tall, with limbs that stretched too far, its face obscured by the hood of a tattered coat. I could only see the edge of it, but I didn't need to see more to know that whatever was out there was not human. I reached for my phone, fingers trembling as I dialed the number for the police. The call didn't go through. I tried again, the screen showing a no-service message. The scraping grew louder, closer. It was coming up the steps, slow and deliberate. My mind raced, trying to think of what I should do. I had no weapon, no way of defending myself. The sound stopped just outside the door, and then a soft, wet thud followed by a dragging sound. I backed away, holding my breath as I watched the doorknob twist and shift, as if something was trying to turn it from the outside. The wood groaned as pressure was applied, and I feared it wouldn't hold. Suddenly, the pressure eased, and the sound of footsteps receded, fading back into the night. My heart pounded, but the silence was deafening. I waited, unable to move, until the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the field in a harsh, bright light. There was no sign of what I had seen. The next morning, I found the front steps littered with long, dark claw marks, deep enough to splinter the wood, and when I looked out at the field, the corn stalks had been flattened, as if something heavy had moved through them. But most disturbing of all was the fresh, muddy handprint pressed against the window. The night my world change started like any other. My friends and I had decided to take an evening trip to the old observatory on the hill. It had been closed for years, abandoned. The last astronomer mysteriously vanished. Rumor had it the place was haunted, but we were young and reckless, ready for any thrill. We didn't believe the stories. The climb up the hill was steep and damp from an earlier rain, the air thick with the scent of moss and pine. The observatory loomed above us, its weathered stone walls cracked with age and covered in ivy that reached out like fingers. The sky was clear, a tapestry of stars, and the moon cast a ghostly glow over everything. Inside, the observatory was dark and silent. The main dome creaked under the weight of time, the giant telescope pointing skyward like a skeletal finger. We wandered through, laughing and daring each other to explore deeper into the building. It wasn't until we reached the old basement that things started to feel wrong. The temperature dropped, and a metallic scent filled the air. We exchanged uneasy glances, but curiosity pushed us forward. The basement was full of old equipment, charts, and abandoned papers scattered like leaves. At the far end was a door, half open, with the faint light seeping through the cracks. Before anyone could stop me, I pushed it open. Inside was a small room, cluttered with old photographs and a large, moth-eaten chair. But the strangest part was the mirror. It was an antique, with a frame carved from dark wood and intricate patterns that seemed to twist if you looked at them too long. I stepped closer, feeling a chill creep over my skin. "Hey, come on," Emily called from behind. "Let's get out of here." I nodded, but as I moved, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Only, it wasn't my reflection. The face staring back at me was pale and gaunt, eyes hollow and dark. It grinned, but it was not my smile. I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest. "There's something in the mirror," I whispered. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the air felt thick, as if something were pressing against my chest. A sound, like the faintest whisper, moved through the room. My friends crowded around, confusion and fear etched on their faces. "What is it?" Marcus asked, stepping forward. Before I could answer, the reflection in the mirror changed. It was no longer just a face, it was an entire scene, a vivid replay of a moment I didn't recognize. A man, hunched over and gasping, in the very room we stood in. His reflection stared at me, eyes wide with terror, as if he knew I was watching him. Then, without warning, his hand reached out, fingers splayed, as though trying to pull me in, get away from it. Emily screamed. I wanted to move, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The room shuddered, the floor creaking as though it were about to split open. A cold wind surged past me, carrying with it a voice that echoed in my mind. "Help me." I snapped back to reality, stumbling away from the mirror as it cracked, the glass shattering in a spray of sharp, jagged pieces. The chill lifted, and the room returned to its stillness. My friends were staring at me, fear radiating off them like heat. "What did you see?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling. I looked around, not sure how to answer. The air felt normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the mirror was still there, waiting for me to return. We left the basement without speaking, the silence heavy between us. When we finally stepped out into the open night, the stars above felt colder, the moon more watchful. I never went back to that observatory, none of us did. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I catch my reflection in a dark window and see a pale, hollow-eyed face grinning at me from the glass. It's not just a reflection, it's waiting. The sun had just set, painting the sky a deep, fiery orange when I arrived at my grandparents' old farmhouse. They had passed years ago, but I still visited their home to keep the place in good shape. My parents were out of town, and I thought it would be the perfect time to finish up some repairs and enjoy the peace and quiet of the country. The house was surrounded by fields of tall corn that creaked in the wind. The soft, rhythmic rustling made for a strange sort of comfort as I walked through the yard. But, as the night deepened, that comfort began to twist into something else, something cold. I was in the kitchen, trying to fix the sink when I heard the first sound, a soft, rhythmic thud, as if something were tapping against the side of the house. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just the wind against the wood. But then the thudding grew louder and more insistent, moving around the perimeter of the house. My heart skipped a beat as I turned off the tap and listened intently. The noise came from the back of the house, near the barn. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left on the counter, trying to steady my shaking hands. The light cut through the darkness in a narrow beam, illuminating the yard in jagged strips of silver and black. I took a step outside, the air suddenly colder. The crickets had stopped singing, and the wind had died down to a whisper. It felt as if the world was holding its breath. I aimed the flashlight at the barn and froze. The door, which had always hung slightly ajar, was now wide open, creaking as it swayed gently in the breeze. And standing in the doorway was a figure. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But then the figure moved, a tall, thin silhouette with long arms and a head that was too large for its body. It shifted, like it was trying to get a better look at me. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I took a step back. The barn door creaked again, this time louder, as if something had stepped forward into the moonlight. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. It was then that I realized the figure was holding something. A long, curved blade that caught the light and reflected it in a way that made my skin prickle. It pointed the blade at me, then tilted its head, as if curious. The silence was deafening. I stumbled backward and nearly fell over a rock. My flashlight hit the ground and rolled, the beam sweeping over the cornfield that surrounded the property. The movement caught my attention. There were more of them, figures emerging from between the stalks. Tall, thin shapes, all with strange, twisted limbs and empty eyes that glowed a pale blue in the moonlight. My breath quickened. I scrambled to pick up the flashlight. The figure in the barn didn't move, but the others in the cornfield did, closing in around the house. I knew I had to run, but my legs felt like lead. I aimed the beam of the flashlight at the nearest one, and it flinched back, letting out a sound that was somewhere between a hiss and a low, wet growl. I bolted toward the front of the house, racing past the porch and slamming my hand against the door. It creaked open just as I stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. The old lock clicked into place, and I pressed my back against the wood, gasping for breath. The thudding returned, only now it was inside, pounding against the walls and floor like 100 feet, shuffling over the old wood. I turned and grabbed a rusty old poker from the fireplace, my knuckles white as I gripped it. Then the whisper came, so soft I almost didn't hear it. A voice, as thin as the wind, whispering in the dark, "Not done. Not done." I spun around, the flashlight catching a glimpse of a pale face pressed against the window, eyes wide and glowing like the figures outside. It mouthed the same words, over and over, and that's when I realized, whatever these things were, they were waiting for me to step outside. They wanted me to leave, to join them under the moonlight. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the cold silence of the night. The house seemed to breathe around me, its ancient wood creaking in time with my heartbeat. I dared a glance outside and saw nothing but the moonlit corn, swaying gently in the wind, but I knew they were still out there, lurking in the dark, waiting for the next moment I might open a door or step out of the safety of the house. And I knew I would never forget their eyes, those cold, empty eyes that glowed in the dark. It was supposed to be a simple day trip. My friends and I had decided to spend the afternoon exploring the cliffs overlooking the lake, a spot known for its breathtaking views and an old, rusted watchtower that people claimed had been abandoned for decades. None of us were prepared for what we'd find that day. The sun was warm, casting long golden light across the grass and trees. We parked at the edge of the hiking path and made our way toward the cliffs. The path was narrow and winding, with patches of moss that clung to the rocks like velvet. I shivered, and before I could say anything, Gabe let out a loud gasp. I turned to see him staring out into the distance, eyes wide with terror. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing at the water. My gaze followed, and I saw it, a figure, standing in the middle of the lake. It was too far to make out details, but it looked human, its arms outstretched as if reaching for something. A thin mist was rising around it, curling in slow, ghostly waves. "What the hell?" I muttered. One of my friends, Mia, stepped beside me, peering over the edge of the tower. "It's probably just a log or something," she said, but her voice was strained. Her eyes locked on the figure that wasn't moving. A moment later, the figure turned its head, and we all recoiled as if struck. It was weather-beaten, its once proud frame now leaning precariously. The wood was splintered and gray, with vines curling around the base as if trying to hold it together. I hesitated at the base, a sudden chill running down my spine. The air felt heavier here, almost as if it were pressing in on me. "Are you coming or not?" Gabe called, already climbing up the rickety stairs. I followed him, my hands brushing against the rough wood as I took each step. The tower creaked under our weight, the sound echoing like a warning. When we reached the top, I took a deep breath and looked out over the cliff again, but this time, the beauty of the view was overshadowed by a strange feeling. The lake seemed darker, the surface like black glass now, mirroring the sky. Suddenly, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks of the tower. I shivered, and before I could say anything, Gabe let out a loud gasp. I turned to see him staring out into the distance, eyes wide with terror. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing at the water. My gaze followed, and I saw it, a figure, standing in the middle of the lake. It was too far to make out details, but it looked human, its arms outstretched, as if reaching for something. A thin mist was rising around it, curling in slow, ghostly waves. "What the hell?" I muttered. One of my friends, Mia, stepped beside me, peering over the edge of the tower. "It's probably just a log or something," she said, but her voice was strained. Her eyes locked on the figure that wasn't moving. A moment later, the figure turned its head, and we all recoiled as if struck. Its face was blank, pale as marble, with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Then it moved, slowly, gliding across the surface of the water as if it were floating on air. "Run," Gabe said, his voice breaking. We bolted, scrambling down the stairs as fast as we could. The creaking and groaning of the wood seemed to echo the thumping of our hearts, louder with every step we took. When we reached the bottom, we didn't stop running. It was weather-beaten, its once proud frame now leaning precariously. The wood was splintered and gray, with vines curling around the base as if trying to hold it together. I hesitated at the base, a sudden chill running down my spine. The air felt heavier here, almost as if it were pressing in on me. "Are you coming or not?" Gabe called, already climbing up the rickety stairs. I followed him, my hands brushing against the rough wood as I took each step. The tower creaked under our weight, the sound echoing like a warning. When we reached the top, I took a deep breath and looked out over the cliff again, but this time, the beauty of the view was overshadowed by a strange feeling. The lake seemed darker, the surface like black glass now, mirroring the sky. Suddenly, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks of the tower. The old amusement park had been abandoned for years, but I still remembered the stories. Tales of children who had gone missing, strange laughter echoing through the empty rides, and the ghost of the clown who would appear when the wind was just right. It was mostly local legend, but when my friends suggested we visit at midnight, I couldn't resist. There were 5 of us, me, Liam, Sophie, Rosa, and Mark. We parked by the rusted entrance, the iron gates hanging crooked and covered in ivy. The moon cast a pale glow over the place, illuminating the cracked pavement and twisted, metal rides that had once delighted hundreds of people. Now, they loomed like broken skeletons. "Are you sure this is safe?" Rosa asked, clutching her jacket around her. "It's just an old park," Mark said, his voice wavering with nervous excitement. What could happen? We wandered through the main entrance, the gravel crunching underfoot. The air was dense with the scent of old popcorn and the faint metallic tang of rust. My flashlight cut through the dark, landing on the broken Ferris wheel towering above us, its seat swaying in the wind. A low creak echoed as if it were groaning in its sleep. We decided to start with the haunted house. It was a small, decrepit building with peeling paint and shutters that flapped in the breeze. I pushed open the splintered door, and it let out a low, mournful moan. Inside, The darkness was suffocating, the air damp and cold. My flashlight barely cut through it, casting jagged beams across cracked mirrors and plastic skeletons. As we crept deeper into the maze of twisted halls, I noticed the whispers. They were soft at first, like the wind blowing through the building. Then they grew louder, more distinct, until it sounded like children giggling just around the corner. "Did you hear that?" Liam asked, voice tight with fear. "Probably just the wind," I replied, though my own voice sounded uncertain. But when we rounded the corner, we saw a clown in the corner of the room, sitting on a broken stool. It was more than just a mannequin, it was moving. The painted smile was chipped and cracked, revealing teeth that looked unnaturally sharp. Its eyes, hollow and dark, fixed on us. Liam gasped, but before any of us could scream, a loud crash came from behind. We spun around, my heart thundering in my chest. The hallway was empty, but something in the corner caught my eye, a pair of small, muddy shoes, too small for any adult. Then the giggling started again, louder this time, and we bolted. We stumbled out into the night, tripping over debris and each other. Behind us, the laughter followed, echoing through the park like a chorus. The clown was nowhere in sight, but we didn't dare look back. We sprinted to the entrance, but it was no longer there. The iron gates had vanished, replaced by the dark, brambled forest that surrounded the park. The laughter still rang out, coming from every direction now. My flashlight flickered, and in the cold glow, I saw them children, dressed in tattered clothes, eyes wide and empty, standing in the shadows. Mark screamed as one of them stepped forward, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it was the same pair of muddy shoes. The children were staring at us, their faces blank, but there was no mistaking their intent. They moved toward us, slow at first, then faster, their little feet pattering against the ground like raindrops. I grabbed Rose's hand and pulled her with me as we ran. We didn't stop until we burst out of the woods and into the clearing where the main road lay. Behind us, the laughter still called, fading slowly as we put distance between ourselves and the park. When we turned back, the amusement park was gone. The moonlight shone on an empty field. That was the last time I ever saw it, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint laughter echoing in the distance and know they're still waiting. Eyes watching, feet pattering closer with every passing second. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and violet as we made our way down the narrow path that led to the old lighthouse. It had been a spontaneous decision, one that seemed adventurous at the time. 3 friends, a quiet evening, and the promise of a breathtaking view. But that promise quickly faded as we approached the towering, weather-beaten structure. The lighthouse had been out of service for years, and rumors swirled that it was haunted. I dismissed them all. Ghosts were for people who wanted to believe in something more. But now, as the wind carried the scent of the sea and the grass around the path swayed, I wasn't so sure. The closer we got, the colder it felt, even though summer had just begun. "Are you sure about this?" Hannah asked, her voice wavering. She was always the cautious one in the group. "Relax, Hannah," Paul said, shoving his hands in his pockets. "We're just going to check it out." The door creaked as we pushed it open, revealing a set of steep, narrow stairs spiraling upward. Each step was worn smooth, and the walls smelt of salt and age. We took turns going up, the air growing colder with each step, the only sound our footsteps and the occasional gust of wind slipping through the cracks in the old building. I was the last to climb to the top, catching my breath and feeling the hair on the back of my neck prickle. The moon had fully risen now, bathing the world in silver light, and the view from the top was breathtaking. The sea stretched out in every direction, its waves glistening under the moon's pale glow. "This is incredible," Hannah whispered, eyes wide as she gazed out. "Look at that," Paul pointed, his voice barely audible over the wind. I followed his gaze and noticed something strange, a shadow moving just below the waterline, far out where the waves crashed against the rocks. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. It looked almost human, but distorted, jerking and twisting in the water like it was in pain. "Guys, you see that, right?" I said, my voice shaking. But neither Hannah nor Paul answered. I glanced back and froze. They were staring at me, eyes wide and unblinking, but their expressions were twisted, almost as if they were in pain. "Paul, Hannah, what's wrong?" I asked, taking a step forward. Their mouths opened, but it wasn't their voices that came out. It was a low, gurgling sound, a mix of laughter and something that sounded like 100 voices speaking at once. I stumbled backward, feeling a sudden cold grip my chest. The air around me seemed to twist and warp, the familiar sea scent now sharp and metallic. Before I could react, the shadow below surged upward, a dark, formless mass with eyes that were a perfect, unnatural shade of black and filled with something that made me freeze in terror. The wind screamed louder, almost drowning out the sound of my own heartbeat. Paul and Hannah's faces contorted, their eyes still locked on me, but now I saw what was happening. Their bodies twitched and shuddered, limbs moving like marionettes controlled by an unseen hand. Then I understood. Whatever was in the water was trying to pull them in, trying to make them part of itself. "Help us," Paul mouthed, and for a moment, I thought I saw my best friend in there, struggling, trying to break free. But the shadow was too strong. I turned and ran down the stairs, 2 steps at a time. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in. The wind followed me, whispering unintelligible words that made my skin crawl. I made it out of the lighthouse and stumbled into the grass, gasping for air as I looked back. The silhouette of Paul and Hannah was still at the top, staring out at me with eyes as black as the sea. I kept running, all the way to the road, where headlights shone in the distance. I flagged down a car, my voice hoarse as I told the driver to take me away from here. I didn't look back until the lighthouse was a small dot in the rearview mirror, but when I did, I swear I saw those same black eyes staring at me from the top of the tower. Watching, waiting, they were still there, and I knew I had to go back, because whatever had taken them had already set its eyes on me. The summer I turned 18, my cousins and I decided to spend the weekend at their grandparents' old farm. The house was on the edge of a small, sleepy town, surrounded by fields that stretched for miles and a patch of forest on one side. I had spent summers there when I was younger, but this time felt different. The place was darker. Somehow, even in the middle of the day, we arrived around mid-afternoon. The farm had a rusted, creaky metal gate that looked like it might fall apart if you touched it, and the paint on the house was chipped and faded. It had been a while since anyone had taken care of it. After we settled in, we explored the property, climbing trees, poking around the old barn, and chasing each other through the long grass. The scent of hay and earth clung to the air, sweet and sharp dot as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky deepened into a rich, bruised blue. That was when we noticed the sound. It started as a low rumble from the woods behind the house, like the growl of distant thunder. But it wasn't quite right. It had a steady, pulsing rhythm to it, almost like footsteps. We looked at each other, nervous laughter escaping us as we tried to dismiss it. Probably just some wild animal, my cousin Peter said, though his voice wavered. But the noise grew louder, and we started hearing whispers, thin and rustling, coming from the woods. It was then that I realized there was a pattern to the noise, like someone was walking through the underbrush, trying to stay hidden but failing. We huddled together, trying to make sense of it. I was about to suggest we go back inside when the air turned colder, and a shadow fell across the yard. A figure stepped out of the forest. It was thin and bent, its limbs moving in jerky motions, like a marionette with tangled strings. I couldn't breathe. The figure took a step forward, and its face came into view. It was pale, almost translucent, with eyes that were dark pits, as if they had been carved out. A low, rasping breath escaped its mouth, and it tilted its head, like it was studying us. Run. I whispered. We bolted for the house, hearts pounding in our chests. I could hear the figure shuffling behind us, the leaves crunching underfoot. We slammed the door shut, the lock clicking into place just as the figure reached it. For a moment, there was silence. Then came a sharp, scraping sound, like nails dragging down the door. We huddled in the dark, staring at the thin sliver of light under the door. The whispers came again, this time louder, more insistent. I felt a rush of cold air move across my skin, as though something was just inches away. The sound of scraping shifted to a loud thump. And then it stopped. We dared to breathe again, the fear making us dizzy. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. My cousins whispered about calling for help, but the landline in the kitchen was dead, the cord frayed and hanging limply. Suddenly, a soft knock came from the back door. Peter glanced at me, eyes wide, and whispered, "It's inside." We moved as a group to the kitchen, every step echoing in the silent house. I peeked through the cracked door, and the sight made my blood freeze. The figure was standing on the porch, staring at us through the glass. It didn't move, didn't blink. But then, its mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, and it spoke in a voice like wind through dead branches. "You shouldn't have come back." We backed away, the noise of the night outside pressing in around us. The whispers returned, but this time, they were joined by a second voice, then a third. Shapes began to form in the windows, figures pressing their faces against the glass, eyes black and hollow. The next thing I remember is waking up in the middle of the yard at dawn, the others scattered around me. The house was silent, its doors and windows closed, as if nothing had happened. We checked every room, but there was no sign of the figures, no sound at all. But when I went to the window and looked out at the woods, I saw it again, standing at the edge of the trees, waiting. And I knew that, whatever had been there, it hadn't left. It started out as an ordinary evening. I was taking a drive with my cousin along the back roads that wound through the farmland, just past the last edge of town. We had spent the day in the city, going to a farmer's market and picking up some homemade snacks. The sun was setting, painting the fields in rich shades of orange and purple. It was late enough that the farmhouses and silos blended into the landscape, their outlines softened by the dusk. We took a turn onto a dirt road that led to a small lake, one my cousin, Jack, had discovered when he was a kid. The road was overgrown with tall, swaying grass, and the trees that flanked it were so thick they seemed to close in around us. I never liked that road, not because it was creepy, but because it had an eerie way of making you feel like you were being watched. I figured it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but I never said anything to Jack. We parked the car by the lake's edge and grabbed our things. The air was warm and thick, and as we walked to the water, the sounds of the nearby farm animals were replaced by the buzz of cicadas and the occasional hoot of an owl. We settled in on an old, rotting bench that was too far gone to be comfortable, but just right for nostalgia. As the night settled in, we swapped stories, laughed at old memories, and watched the water ripple in the moonlight. I leaned back, taking a deep breath of the crisp air. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move near the tree line. I blinked, dismissing it as an animal or my imagination. But then it happened again, a shadow flitting between the dark trunks, too fast to be a deer. "Jack, did you see that?" I whispered. Jack looked up, squinting into the darkness. "What?" I didn't answer. I was already walking toward the tree line, my heart hammering in my chest. The moonlight barely reached that far, and the shadows seemed to pulse as if something unseen was breathing in the dark. Then, a sound, a rustling. It was coming from just behind the first row of trees, right where I was standing. My pulse quickened, my breath caught. "Hey, let's head back," Jack called, his voice tense. "It's getting late." I nodded, hesitating to turn around. I took one last glance at the dark outline of the woods before stepping away. Just as I turned back to the lake, I heard a thud and a quick, skittering noise, like something large moving fast through the underbrush. Then, silence. "Let's go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. As we made our way back to the car, the air seemed colder, the forest darker. The buzzing of the cicadas had stopped, and an unnatural quiet settled over us. When we reached the car, I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized something. The sounds of the forest had been replaced with a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from behind the trees. I pulled open the car door, fumbling with the keys. Jack was already inside, his hands clenched on the steering wheel. I threw myself in, and just as I slammed the door shut, a shadow flitted past the car, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. "Drive, Jack," I yelled, voice tight. The car roared to life, tires spinning on the gravel as we tore down the path. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel the eyes on us, the pressure of something following in the dark. It wasn't until we reached the main road, and the town lights came into view, that the weight on my chest began to lift. When we finally stopped, breathing ragged and shaking, Jack turned to me. "Did you see it?" he whispered. I nodded, voice barely a croak. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't anything from the woods. Jack's eyes widened, but before he could say anything, I felt the sensation that we were still being watched. The dark, hunched shape of the woods behind us seemed to shift, and then the glint of something pale, stared out from between the trees, and that was when I knew we weren't alone. The summer evenings were always warm, but there was a strange bite in the air that night. I had been out for a late walk in the fields behind the old farmhouse. The path was familiar. I had grown up here, the creaking fence and the wildflowers like old friends, but tonight felt different. The crickets were silent, and the usual hum of nature seemed to be holding its breath. I reached the old well at the edge of the field, a spot I hadn't visited in years. The well was covered with a rusty grate, the metal bent and weathered. I paused, staring down into its dark mouth, half expecting to hear the splash of water or the distant drip of something unseen. Instead, I heard a low, rhythmic thumping. I stepped back, my heart pounding. It came from behind me, a sound like someone walking on dry leaves. I spun around, breath caught in my throat, but there was no one. Just the wind pushing the tall grass in ripples. I told myself I was being paranoid. But then I heard it again, soft steps, coming from the direction of the farmhouse. I took off running, faster than I had in years, past the fields and through the orchard. The branches of the apple trees clawed at my arms, and the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. I glanced back and saw nothing, but that thumping sound had followed me, close enough to make my pulse race. I reached the house, slamming the door behind me and bolting it shut. The old wood shuddered under the weight of my panic. My grandmother's clock ticked on the wall, its second hand moving with a deliberate slowness, mocking me. I forced myself to catch my breath, trying to convince myself it had just been an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. I was just about to turn on the radio to break the silence when I heard it. The thumping had stopped. Now there was a slow, dragging noise, as if something heavy was being pulled across the porch outside. I froze, listening. The sound came closer, pausing right at the front door. I glanced around the room, searching for something to defend myself with. My fingers found the edge of a heavy iron candlestick, and I gripped it tightly as the sound moved from the porch to the side of the house. I could hear breathing now, shallow and ragged, like something was trying to catch its breath. The silence returned, broken only by the beat of my heart and the ticking of the clock. I dared to look out the side window, the one that faced the barn, and I saw a shadow moving in the moonlight. It was too big to be a person. It was too unnatural. Suddenly, the barn door creaked open, and for a split second, I could see a dark figure standing there, its limbs too long and its head tilted at an impossible angle. The shape tilted its head up to look at me through the window, and even from a distance, I could see the smile stretched wide across its face, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. I stumbled back, the candlestick clattering to the floor. My grandmother's voice echoed in my head, "Never turn your back on the dark," but that was impossible now. The creature moved forward, and the air grew cold as frost started to creep along the window pane. A sudden crash from the front of the house made me spin around. The door splintered as something slammed into it, but the lock held. I could see the creature at the window now, its eyes locked on mine, black and wet like oil. It reached out, fingers stretching in impossible ways, scraping against the glass with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. The clock stopped, mid-tick. The room went dark, the silence deep and suffocating. Then, I heard the voice, soft and hollow, like it was coming from under the floorboards. "Let me in." I took a deep breath and bolted for the back door, grabbing my coat and running out into the night. The wind picked up, and the sound of the creature behind me was drowned out by a roar like 100 voices crying out at once. I didn't look back until I reached the road, my legs trembling and my chest burning. I glanced over my shoulder, but the house was empty, silent once more, and the field behind it was blanketed in shadows. I didn't stop running until I reached town, and even then, I never spoke of that night to anyone. I don't know what it was or where it came from, but I know one thing for sure: it was waiting for me, and it was only a matter of time before it came back. The sun had barely set when we drove into the winding, narrow roads leading to the lake. My friends and I were headed out for an evening of fishing, a break from the city's noise and suffocating lights. The lake, bordered by tall trees and surrounded by nothing but silence, was the perfect escape. It felt like stepping back in time, to a place where people didn't exist except for us. We parked the old van by the shore, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, and got out to stretch. The smell of the lake hit me first, fresh, earthy, mixed with a hint of moss. It was peaceful, serene, almost too quiet. We set up our gear and started fishing, the water lapping gently against the dock. Conversation was light, punctuated by the occasional splash of a fish or a distant hoot of an owl. I leaned back, letting the breeze ruffle my hair, when I heard something else, a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from the woods behind us. I glanced at the others, but they seemed oblivious, engrossed in their own lines. "Anyone else hear that?" I asked, forcing a laugh to mask the tremor in my voice. "Probably just an animal," Mark replied, barely looking up. I wasn't so sure. The thumping grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the kind of sound an animal would make. It was too regular, like footsteps or something dragging across the forest floor. I shifted in my seat, eyes darting toward the trees where the fading light couldn't reach. I heard a rustling and stiffened. A branch snapped, followed by a low, guttural sound. My friends, still unbothered, chatted about the fish they hoped to catch, but I couldn't focus. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I stayed rooted to the dock, staring into the darkness. The air grew colder, carrying a sharp, metallic scent that made me gag. That was when I saw a flash of movement, too fast for my eyes to catch. The thumping stopped. There was silence, a silence so complete it pressed against my ears. "Hey, you guys okay?" I asked, finally getting the courage to break the tension. "Fine," said Mia, casting her line again, but I saw her glance nervously at the forest behind us. I wasn't the only one who felt it. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the tree line, limping forward with an uneven gait. It was tall, too tall, with long arms that hung almost to the ground. Its skin was pale, mottled, with dark veins that seemed to pulse beneath the surface. Its face was gaunt, eyes hollow, mouth twisted into a grimace that looked more like a snarl. Before I could shout or run, it let out a sound that made the air crackle, a mix between a human scream and the screech of a bird. We scrambled to our feet, stumbling over our fishing gear as we tried to make sense of what we were seeing. "Run!" Mark shouted, and we bolted, sprinting toward the van, the sound of uneven feet pounding behind us. We didn't look back. We didn't dare. I reached the van first, yanking open the door as Mia and Mark threw themselves in. The engine roared to life, and we peeled out, the headlights illuminating the woods in wild, frantic sweeps. The figure stood there, watching us, unmoving, but I could feel its eyes boring into me even as we drove away. We didn't stop until we were back in the city, the noise of traffic and the glow of streetlights making it feel like a different world. We didn't speak as we sat in the van, the quiet pressing down on us like a weight. And then came the knock at the window. We froze, heartbeats thundering. Outside, standing just beyond the safety of the glass, was the figure from the woods. Its face was now pressed against the window, mouth open as if to scream, but instead, it made that same guttural, bird-like noise. Mark couldn't take it. He jammed the car into gear, tires screeching as we pulled away. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, the figure was still there, watching us, its eyes wide and hollow, as if waiting for us to return. It never followed us home, but I swear I heard that same rhythmic thumping as I lay in bed that night, and I knew it was waiting for me, somewhere in the dark, waiting to come back. It was an ordinary Saturday, and I decided to spend the day exploring the local flea market. It was sprawling and chaotic, filled with vendors selling everything from vintage clothing to antique furniture. I loved getting lost in the maze of tents and booths, weaving around people as I sifted through old trinkets and forgotten relics. Midway through the afternoon, I found myself drawn to a small, nondescript booth in the corner of the market. The man running it had an air of mystery, dressed in a tattered coat with eyes that flickered like candle flames whenever they caught the sunlight. The items on display were bizarre. Antique dolls with cracked porcelain faces, black and white photographs of people I didn't recognize, and small, delicate boxes with strange carvings. I was just about to leave when I spotted an old music box. It was ornately carved, with tiny dancers spinning in circles beneath a glass dome. I reached out, and as my fingers brushed it, the man's voice cut through the noise of the market. "Careful with that," he said, his tone sharp. "It's been known to attract attention." I froze, looking up at him. His smile was thin, almost predatory. "What kind of attention?" I asked, half joking. He leaned closer, eyes glinting with something unholy. "The kind you don't want." Before I could respond, a loud crash came from nearby, followed by the sound of panicked voices. I turned and saw a crowd gathering around a stall that had toppled over, scattering its contents across the pavement. My heart thudded with the sudden burst of chaos, and I shook my head, trying to ignore the man's words. I left the booth, music box still in hand, though it felt wrong, heavy in a way that didn't make sense. I wandered through the market, the noise and laughter suddenly grating on my nerves. The sun began to dip, casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement, and the air grew colder. Then, the music started. A soft, tinkling melody floated up from the music box I still held. It was a simple song, but it sent a chill crawling up my spine. I looked down at it, heart pounding, but the dancers remained frozen beneath the dome. The music should have stopped. The box wasn't wound up. I tried to put it down, but my fingers clamped tighter around it, as if someone else had control. I felt a cold breeze sweep through the market, stirring up paper cups and plastic bags. The voices of the crowd blurred into a low hum, as though muffled by a thick wall. And then I saw her, a girl in a faded, old-fashioned dress standing at the far end of the market. Her face was pale, with eyes like black holes that seemed to pierce right through me. She took a slow step forward, and the music box continued its haunting song. My pulse quickened, and I stumbled backward, bumping into someone behind me. I whirled around, but the market was empty, save for me and the girl who now stood only a few feet away. The air grew colder, a sharp, biting chill that turned my breath to fog. I took another step back, but the girl's head tilted slightly, a cruel grin spreading across her face. A voice, thin and chilling, echoed inside my mind, "Play with me." The music box clattered to the pavement as I tried to run. My legs felt heavy, like I was wading through water, and my breath came in ragged gasps. But no matter how hard I pushed, I couldn't move faster than the girl. Her eyes never left mine, and with every step, the air around us seemed to grow darker. I finally broke through the market and into the empty parking lot, where the late afternoon light was dim and dying. I couldn't see her anymore, but the song still played, winding through the parking lot like a thread pulling me back toward the chaos. I turned to grab the music box, but it was gone. I searched frantically, eyes darting over the cracked pavement. The song stopped suddenly, cutting off in a sharp note. Silence fell like a weight, and I swore I heard the faint sound of soft footsteps behind me. I spun around, but the market was empty. The girl had vanished, and with her, the eerie melody that haunted me like a ghost. That was the last time I went back to that flea market, and the last time I ever heard a music box play. But I know it's still out there, waiting, because I can still hear the faint, haunting notes when the wind picks up at night. The bus ride was long and uncomfortable, but I couldn't complain. I was finally visiting my grandmother's farm for the summer, a place I hadn't seen since I was a child. My parents said she had been lonely, so I decided to take a break from my busy city life and spend the next 2 weeks out in the open fields. The bus dropped me off in front of the weathered farmhouse, the wood painted a peeling red that clashed with the green of the fields. I smiled, inhaling the crisp, dry air, trying to drown out the nagging feeling that I was forgetting something important. Grandma was waiting for me on the porch. Her hair was white, her smile wide and welcoming. We hugged, and she took my bags inside. The first few days were idyllic. Long walks through the meadows, fresh milk from the cows, and evenings spent on the porch as the sun sank into a horizon of tall, whispering corn stalks. But as the days wore on, I noticed the odd things. At night, when the world was dark and silent, I would hear a faint tapping sound, like a pebble hitting the window. I'd wake up, heart racing, and see only shadows in the moonlight. Grandma assured me it was just the wind, or the old house settling, but I didn't believe her. It wasn't just the tapping, there was something else. Something moving in the fields, just beyond the reach of the porch light. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. I sat up, breathless, listening. The noise came closer, slow and heavy, until it stopped. My heart pounded. I slipped into my shoes and crept to the window. The moonlight spilled across the land, casting everything in a cold, silvery glow. I gasped when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the cornfield, unmoving. It was tall, impossibly so, with thin limbs that seemed to bend in unnatural ways. Its head was tilted back, and its eyes were nothing but dark, hollow pits. I blinked and it was gone, vanished into the maze of stalks. My mind raced. It was too dark, too far for me to see clearly. I shivered, questioning my sanity. Maybe it was just an illusion, a trick of the moonlight. I turned to find Grandma asleep in her chair, breathing steady and deep. But when I looked at the clock, I noticed the time, 3:27 a.m., the same time the tapping had started, the same time the footsteps came. The next day, the sun hung heavy in the sky as I worked with Grandma in the barn. She hummed a tune while she sorted feed, and I thought maybe I had been imagining things after all. But, as the day ended and dusk began to settle, a low rumble in the distance caught my attention. It was coming from the direction of the cornfield. Grandma noticed too, pausing mid-task. Her eyes darted to the field, and a shadow flickered across her face. "It's the crows," she said, her voice unsteady. "They don't like it when he comes." I frowned, puzzled. "Who?" Grandma didn't answer, and I felt a chill spread through me. That night, I sat in the dark, the old house creaking as it settled. The tapping started again, and then, faintly, a low humming sound, like a twisted lullaby. I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sensation of something watching me. I turned my head, eyes adjusting to the faint light, and there it was, the figure from before, standing at the window. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. Its hollow eyes met mine, and it moved. Fingers splayed against the glass as if it were trying to press through. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy book, and threw it at the glass. The window shattered, and for a split second, the figure vanished. I ran to find Grandma. I found her at the kitchen table, staring out the window into the dark. She didn't turn to look at me, and when I approached her, I noticed her hand was pressed tightly against the glass, leaving behind a print I couldn't understand. It wasn't the mark of a human hand. "It's here," she whispered, eyes wide with a terror I'd never seen before. "And he's coming back." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed outside. Not from the field, but from within the house. Slow, deliberate, right behind me. I didn't need to look. I knew I wouldn't like what I saw. I was out for a late-night stroll through the neighborhood, hoping to clear my mind after a long day. The streets were empty, the streetlights casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the pavement. It was the kind of night that felt a little too still, the kind of night when you know something's off but can't pinpoint what. I turned down a side street I hadn't walked down before. The houses here were older, with peeling paint and cracked shutters. The gardens were overgrown, wild ivy creeping up the walls like it was trying to pull the houses back into the ground. I felt a strange mix of curiosity and apprehension, but the quiet seemed inviting, so I pushed forward. I was about to turn back when I heard a soft, rhythmic thumping sound coming from inside one of the houses. My first thought was that it was just a creaky floorboard or an old appliance, but then I heard a voice. It was quiet at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder, repeating a single phrase over and over. "Help me, please." It's too late. My skin prickled. I glanced at the windows, but the curtains were drawn tight. I hesitated, torn between running and investigating. The voice was pleading, desperate. My instincts won out over my fear, and I found myself walking up to the front door, my knuckles white as I clenched them. The door creaked open when I pushed against it, as if inviting me inside. I stepped into the dark, the smell of mildew and something metallic filling my nose. The voice was louder now, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I tiptoed through the living room, every floorboard creaking beneath my feet. I didn't know why I was going toward the sound, but it was like I was being pulled by an unseen force. I reached the stairs and paused. The voice was coming from above, echoing down like a tortured plea. "Help me, it's too late." I swallowed hard and started up the steps, my heart pounding as the air grew colder with each step. The hallway at the top of the stairs was pitch black, but the voice led me to a room at the end. I pushed open the door and gasped. The room was empty except for a rocking chair, which was moving back and forth as if someone had just left it. The voice stopped suddenly, and a heavy silence fell over the room. I could feel the air pressing against me, thick and suffocating. Then I heard a sound like breathing, close and ragged. I spun around, but there was no one there. The chair stopped rocking. My blood ran cold as I felt a presence behind me, something sharp brushing against my neck. I turned quickly and saw a figure in the hallway, a shadow with eyes that glowed a deep, unnatural red. I stumbled back, hitting the wall with a thud. The shadow moved closer, its limbs stretching impossibly long, and then I realized what it was. It was me, or at least a version of me, eyes hollow and face twisted in a grotesque smile. "It's too late," it whispered, reaching out with fingers that were more like claws. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the chair, which had started rocking again, as if waiting for me to take a seat. When I woke up, I was outside the house, lying in the grass with the first rays of dawn creeping over the horizon. I stumbled to my feet and ran home, my mind reeling. I never spoke about what happened that night, but I'll never forget the look in those eyes, and every night since then, I hear that voice, echoing through the quiet streets. "Help me, please. It's too late." It started as an innocent idea. My friends and I were looking for something to do one evening, and when Mark suggested we explore the abandoned amusement park just outside of town, it seemed like the perfect adventure. We were young, reckless, and eager for a thrill, unaware that the park had a reputation. The sun was just beginning to set as we approached the rusted gates, which hung crooked and creaked in the wind. The faded, peeling sign read "Wonderland of Wonders" in letters that had almost been swallowed by time. We stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of metal and the faint, sharp tang of rust. The place was silent except for the soft rustle of leaves and the distant screech of a crow. We walked past the ticket booth, its glass pane shattered and dark, and made our way to the old Ferris wheel. It loomed above us, a skeletal giant. The paint was chipped and flaking, and the seats were bent and warped, some hanging at odd angles. We dared each other to climb up into the rusted cars and take photos. I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture as Sam posed dramatically, making a face. That's when we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like a stick tapping on metal. At first, I thought it was just a rodent, but then it came again, closer this time. I glanced at Mark, who was staring at the carousel. The horses were frozen mid-gallop, their eyes wide and hollow, as if they had seen something that terrified them. "Did you hear that?" Mark whispered. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely above a breath. We all exchanged uneasy glances, the jovial air now replaced with tension. We started walking toward the carousel when the tapping sound came again, this time from behind us. I turned quickly, heart racing, but the place was empty. Just the broken down rides, the scattered debris, and the wind that seemed to have picked up speed. "Maybe we should leave," I suggested, glancing nervously at the way we had come. "No, let's check out the fun house," Sam said, his voice cracking. He tried to sound brave, but it came out hollow. We hesitated, but curiosity won out, and we made our way toward the warped fun house at the center of the park. The entrance was a gaping mouth, the teeth jagged and chipped. The darkness inside seemed to beckon us. We stepped inside, and the air grew colder, the smell of damp and decay stronger. The floor creaked as we moved through, and suddenly the sound started up again, tapping, like fingernails on glass. I shivered, but before I could say anything, Sam screamed. We rushed to him, finding him backed up against a mirror, staring at his reflection. But it wasn't just his reflection, it was a face, pale and wide-eyed, staring back at him with a grin that stretched impossibly wide. It moved, just slightly, tilting its head like it was studying him. He stumbled away, pushing past us, and we bolted out of the funhouse, gasping for breath. Outside, the wind had stopped, and the silence was deafening. We didn't speak, just ran back to the entrance, but as I glanced behind me, I saw hundreds of reflections in the shattered mirrors of the funhouse, all faces that were watching us, grinning, unmoving. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of the main road, gasping and shaking, looking back to see the amusement park shrouded in darkness. The only light was the faint glow of the moon, casting long, Eerie shadows across the broken rides. To this day, we never speak of what happened there. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a soft tapping sound, like nails on glass, and I know that somewhere, in the dark, a reflection is waiting for me to look. It was supposed to be a simple day trip to the old amusement park, long forgotten and left to the elements after the fire that shut it down years ago. My friends and I were always up for a bit of mischief and adventure. So, when we heard the place was still standing, we decided to go check it out. The sun was high, the air crisp with a hint of autumn, and we felt invincible as we parked our car on the cracked pavement and stepped through the rusted gate. The park was a maze of half-collapsed rides and faded attractions, their colors peeling and names barely visible beneath layers of grime. We explored for hours, climbing into the derelict roller coaster, peering into the hollow eyes of animatronic animals in the old petting zoo, and laughing like kids again. The air carried a sense of nostalgia, tinged with something else, something heavy, that clung to our skin. As the sun began to set, a chill settled over the park. It was just past 6 p.m., and shadows stretched across the ground, twisting and bending with the wind. We were on the Ferris wheel when it happened. The creaking of the metal, once a reassuring sound of the ride, grew louder, sharper, as if the wheel was straining under some unseen weight. The laughter between us stopped abruptly as we looked out over the park, searching for what could be causing it. That's when I saw just a flicker at first, like a shadow dancing at the edge of my vision. I leaned over the railing to get a better look, but it was gone. I turned to my friends, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. Their faces mirrored my own apprehension, and I realized none of us wanted to be there. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the first sound was a sharp, metal screech that split the silence. It came from the direction of the old fun house. We all exchanged glances, the air between us charged with a fear that no amount of bravado could dispel. Without a word, we slid out of the Ferris wheel seats and started walking toward the noise, our feet crunching on the gravel path. The fun house loomed ahead, its mirrors shattered and its entrance yawning like a mouth ready to swallow us whole. We stood in front of the broken doors, breath shallow, before stepping inside. The musty smell of mildew and decay surrounded us, and our flashlights cast jittery beams across warped reflections that seemed to twist and stretch as we passed. We turned a corner and saw a figure, half hidden in the shattered shards of a mirror. It was a person, or it had been. The glass had splintered through its face, leaving an expression frozen mid-scream. I gasped, stumbling backward. My friends backed away too, eyes wide, bodies tense as we stared at the broken remains. But then, behind us, came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the darkened hallway. "Go," someone whispered, and we sprinted out of the funhouse, hearts pounding. The path to the exit was obscured by the deepening night, but we kept running, pushing past the amusement rides and dodging the rusted remains of bumper cars. We glanced behind us, but saw nothing, just the stretch of empty, moonlit pathways. But when we reached the old ticket booth, the front door creaked open, and out stepped a figure. It wasn't human. Its limbs were twisted, bent at impossible angles, as if the bones had been replaced with wire and shadows. Its face was a warped mask, half hidden beneath a hood that seemed to flicker like flame. Before we could scream, it was gone, vanished into the night with a movement too quick to follow. We stopped only when we were outside the gate, gasping and clinging to each other, as if the park itself were trying to pull us back in. The next day, I scoured the news for any mention of the park. There was nothing, not a word about strange occurrences or people going missing. But every time I close my eyes, I see that figure at the ticket booth, eyes like hollow black pits, waiting for the next unwelcome visitors. I'll never forget the day I decided to take a solo hike up the mountain. It had been a stressful few weeks, and I needed some time away from the noise, from people. The trail I chose was one I'd been on before, years ago. But today it felt different, almost as if the mountain was watching me. The first few miles were easy, just a steady climb with the scent of pine filling the air. Birds chirped in the distance, and the sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the path. I was lost in my thoughts when I noticed the silence. It wasn't natural, not the kind of silence you get when you're deep in the woods. This was complete, heavy, as if someone had hit the mute button on the world. I stopped, peering around. The breeze had vanished, and the birds had stopped singing. My skin prickled, but I brushed it off as paranoia. I kept going, determined not to let the unease get to me. The trail wound higher, the trees growing thicker, their trunks snarled and blackened as if they had been scorched long ago. The deeper I went, the darker it became, even though it was still afternoon. The light seemed to be swallowed by the woods. Then, I heard a faint, rhythmic thumping. I paused, my heart jumping into my throat. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like someone tapping on wood, over and over. I listened, trying to locate the source, but the sound seemed to move, following me as I hesitated on the path. The thumping grew louder, echoing in the silence. Panic clawed at my chest, and I turned, my eyes darting between the twisted trees. That's when I saw a pale hand, its fingers long and bony, reaching out from behind a tree, just barely visible in the shadow. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward. "Hey," I shouted, my voice cracking. The hand retracted, disappearing behind the tree with a sudden jerk. I stood there, frozen, listening to the silence that followed, my heart thundering in my chest. I had to get out of there. I spun around and bolted down the trail, branches whipping at my face, the thumping still echoing behind me. My legs burned, and I could barely see through the thick underbrush. I was running blindly now, hoping to get to a clearing, a place where I could see. The trail seemed to stretch forever, but then, just as I thought I was about to collapse, I emerged from the woods into a small, sunlit clearing. The air was different here, fresher, warmer. My breathing slowed as I looked around, searching for any sign of the presence that had been following me. And then I saw it. At the far end of the clearing, leaning against a dead tree, was a figure. It was tall, with an unnatural, gangly posture. Its face was obscured by the hood of its tattered cloak, but I could see the faint glow of eyes beneath. They were wide and dark, like wells of black ink, and they stared directly at me. The thumping had stopped, but now there was only the sound of my heartbeat, echoing in my ears. The figure lifted its head, and with a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, it whispered, "You shouldn't be here." I stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me. I fell to the ground, eyes locked on the figure as it took a step forward, the cloak flowing around it like smoke. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw before I blacked out was that pale hand reaching out, fingers long and skeletal. When I woke up, the sun was setting, casting the clearing in an orange glow. The figure was gone. My head pounded as I stood, glancing around the clearing. There was no sign of the trail back down, no sign of the mountain path I had taken. Just the woods, dense and still, like I was trapped in a different world. I heard it again, the thumping, coming from deep within the trees. But this time, it was joined by a second sound: footsteps, rapid and uneven. I turned, my blood turning cold as I realized I wasn't alone, and whatever had followed me was waiting. I've always been the skeptic in the group. Ghosts, monsters, all that stuff, never bought into it. But what happened to me that weekend changed everything. I still can't explain it. A few friends and I rented a cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. The kind of place you'd see in horror movies. Old, isolated, with trees crowding in all around. When we got there, the place was exactly as advertised: quiet, remote, perfect for getting away from the noise of the city. We unpacked, cracked open some beers, and spent the night swapping stories and playing cards. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. I mean, unnaturally quiet, no sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves, just silence. I didn't say anything at first. I chalked it up to being out in the middle of nowhere, but it felt off. That night, as we settled into our rooms, things started to get weird. I was in the downstairs bedroom, one of those with a single window that looked out into the woods. The others were upstairs, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just a normal feeling of being watched. It was as if something was waiting for me. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a loud bang. It sounded like something hit the side of the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The wind was howling outside, but it wasn't that, it was something else. Then came the soft scratching sound, like nails on the wood. It came from just outside my window. I lay there frozen, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or an animal. But the scratching continued, growing louder, more deliberate. I grabbed my phone, thinking maybe I could call someone, but the screen was blank. No signal. I had to check. I slowly got out of bed and tiptoed to the window, my heart racing. I peeked outside, but all I could see was darkness. No movement, no sign of anything that could have made the noise. I was about to turn away when I saw a shadow, just at the edge of the trees. It didn't move like a person, more like a cloud shifting unnaturally in the night. My stomach dropped. I quickly pulled away from the window and ran back to the bed, locking the door behind me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. The next morning, I didn't say anything to my friends. I figured it was just a bad night, and maybe they'd think I was overreacting. But then one of them, Sam, mentioned something strange. I don't know, but last night. I thought I heard something tapping on my window, he said, looking around at us. I thought it was a branch at first, but it sounded like someone knocking. My blood ran cold. I wasn't the only one. That afternoon, we all decided to hike to the nearby creek to clear our heads. It was a peaceful walk, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was following us. Every time I turned around, the woods seemed to close in a little more. I told myself it was just my nerves, but the feeling stayed with me. We returned to the cabin later that day, and things felt off. The air felt thick, like we were being watched. We were sitting in the living room when we heard the sound of footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate. We all froze. Sam stood up, walking to the door. It's probably just an animal, he said, but his voice was shaky. He opened the door. No one was there, but that wasn't the worst part. The door had been left ajar when we arrived. But now, the door was slightly pushed open. It was as if something or someone had been waiting for us to leave the room before making its move. We didn't stay much longer after that. We packed our things and left as quickly as we could. It wasn't until we were safely back in town that I thought to check my phone. Still no signal. But the real kicker came when I saw the pictures I'd taken earlier of the cabin. One of the photos was blurry, taken from the window of my room. In the background, just barely visible, was a face. A face peeking out from behind a tree, grinning, with eyes that didn't look human. To this day, I can't explain what happened. But I know one thing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't an animal. It was something else. Something that was waiting for us to leave so it could follow us. It's still out there. And I'm not sure if it's ever really going to leave. We never planned on staying at the old inn. It was a last-minute decision. One of those spontaneous trips where you just pick a place and go. My friends and I had rented a cabin a few hours away from the city, hoping for a weekend of peace and fun. When we arrived, though, the place felt wrong. There was something about it like a faint, suffocating presence in the air that made my skin prickle. The inn looked fine at first glance, but the moment we stepped inside, everything changed. The wooden floors creaked under our feet, and the smell of dust and old wood filled the air. We checked in with the manager, a pale woman with hollow eyes who barely looked up from her desk. She handed us a key and muttered something about the inn being under renovation, but her words barely registered. It wasn't until we reached our room that the unease settled in. The door groaned as we opened it, revealing an oddly furnished space with peeling wallpaper and a single window covered by heavy curtains. It felt like time had stopped there. The air was stifling, thick with something that made me uneasy. That night, we decided to explore the inn. It was late, but curiosity got the best of us. We wandered through the long hallways, the wooden floorboards echoing under our footsteps. The place was eerily quiet. No sounds of other guests, no laughter, no voices, just silence, broken by the occasional creak of the building settling. Then we heard it. A soft, slow tapping, like fingernails against wood. The sound echoed down the hallway from somewhere behind us. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My friends didn't seem to notice, but I couldn't ignore it. The tapping came again, this time closer, and a shiver ran down my spine. We reached a door at the end of the hall, one that looked different from the others. It was slightly ajar, as though someone had forgotten to close it all the way. We pushed it open cautiously. Inside, the room was dark, but there was an old-fashioned mirror on the wall, one of those large, full-length ones. As I stepped closer, I noticed something strange. There was a figure in the reflection, standing just behind me. But when I turned around, no one was there. I felt a chill run through me, and my friends laughed, thinking it was a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned away quickly, but the tapping sound came again, this time much louder, right outside the door. It was fast now, frantic, like something was desperate to get in. We all rushed out of the room, our nerves on edge. The hall was empty, but the atmosphere had changed. It felt colder, the silence heavier. We walked back toward our room, the tapping following us, echoing down the corridor. My heart raced as we reached our door. The key wouldn't fit into the lock, no matter how many times I tried. It was as if the door itself didn't want us inside. Finally, I pushed the door open with force, and we rushed inside, locking it behind us. But the tapping continued, now accompanied by a faint, whispering voice. It was too faint to understand, but it was there scraping at the edges of my mind. I sat on the bed, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, just a product of the late hour and a creepy atmosphere. But then the room grew unnaturally cold. I looked at the mirror across from me. The reflection was different now. It wasn't me standing there, it was someone else. A figure in tattered clothes, their face obscured by shadows, but their eyes were glowing, watching me. The tapping stopped. The voice grew louder, clearer. "Let me out," it whispered. I jumped back, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, the door to our room creaked open, slowly, on its own. I rushed to shut it, but the door didn't move. It was stuck, like something was holding it from the other side. In the reflection, I saw the figure step toward the door. And then it spoke again, louder now, as if it was right beside me. "You shouldn't have stayed." Suddenly, the door slammed shut, the force of it rattling the walls. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow and quick. I turned to my friends, but they were all staring at the mirror, wide-eyed, as though they were seeing the same thing I was. That's when I understood. The inn wasn't just old, it was a trap. The figure, the whispers, the tapping, it was all part of it. Something wanted us to stay, to never leave. We packed up and left the next morning, the sun barely rising, the inn still silent. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The inn was gone, as if it had never been there at all. Just empty space, surrounded by trees. I don't know what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever was in that inn didn't want us to leave. And it might be waiting for the next people who wander too close. Cabin in the woods, just me and a few friends. No distractions, no work, just nature. We had rented the place online, a secluded spot far from civilization. None of us were particularly into ghost stories. So when we arrived and saw how isolated the cabin was, it felt more peaceful than eerie. The cabin itself was charming, if a bit old. The walls creaked in places, but we didn't think much of it. The first night, after a few drinks and some laughter, we headed to bed, but sleep didn't come easily for me. The room was unnervingly quiet, except for the occasional gust of wind howling outside, and then scratch a faint noise from the other side of the cabin. I chalked it up to the wind or maybe an animal outside, but when the scratching sound continued, it became harder to ignore. It wasn't just random noise, it was deliberate, like something or someone was trying to get inside. I waited for my friends to make a joke about it. When no one did, I decided to get up and check. I crept down the hallway toward the front door, peering through the window at the darkness outside. Nothing. No movement, just trees swaying under the moonlight. I sighed in relief and turned to head back to my room. That's when I heard a soft, desperate knock on the door. Knock. Knock. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. I froze. Who would be knocking at this hour, especially in such a remote place? I moved slowly back toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't open it. I couldn't. I stood there, straining my ears for any sounds. There was nothing, no footsteps, no voices, just silence. I finally returned to my room, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. I locked the door behind me, pulled the blanket over my head, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I mentioned it to my friends, hoping they would laugh it off. But no one did. Instead, Sarah, one of the girls with us, said she heard something too. She described the same scratching sound I'd heard, but from the window. She had thought it was an animal at first, but the knocking she couldn't explain that we spent the day hiking through the woods, trying to clear our heads. It felt like the cabin was miles away from any other human being. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was watching us. That night, after dinner, we were all sitting around the fireplace, and the conversation turned toward local legends. Apparently, the area was known for being haunted, or so the locals claimed. One of my friends, Jake, started telling a story about a woman who had gone missing years ago, her last known location being just a few miles from the cabin. He described how people said they could hear her crying at night. I laughed it off. Ghost stories didn't scare me. Later that night, when we were all in our rooms, I heard the sound again, the unmistakable scratch on the wood. And then, once again, the knock. But this time, it wasn't on the door. It was on my window. I rushed to the window and pulled the curtain back, heart racing. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I closed the curtains quickly, then heard it again. A whisper, faint but clear. Let me in. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body was frozen in place. I glanced toward the door. Still locked. My room felt suffocating. The knock came again. Bang. Louder this time. It was coming from the front door. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran out of my room, down the hall to the living room, and yanked open the door. Nothing. No one was outside. Just the pitch-black darkness of the woods. My breath was coming in sharp gasps as I stood there, staring out into the void. I closed the door, leaning against it, trying to calm myself. And then, in the faint light of the hallway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The doorknob was wet. A trail of dark smudges marked the wooden floor, leading from the door to the window of the living room. I followed the trail, every step feeling like it was pulling me into some kind of nightmare. I reached the window. There, smeared against the glass, was a handprint, and it wasn't small. It was large for a person. I backed away in terror, stumbling toward the door. But when I looked out into the woods again, I saw something. A figure, standing in the distance, just outside the boundary of the trees. It was watching us. It was always watching. I slammed the door shut and rushed to wake the others. But when I turned to tell them, they were all standing in the hallway, staring at me in silence. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear. It wasn't until I looked down that I realized the handprint wasn't on the window. It was on the back of my hand, and it was still wet. We packed up and left at once, leaving the cabin behind. But every time I close my eyes, I still see that figure in the distance. And the worst part, I know it followed us. We never should have left. I never believed in the supernatural, ghosts, spirits, things that go bump in the night. They were all just stories. But that weekend in the cabin changed everything. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing getaway. A few friends and I rented an old cabin up in the woods, far from civilization. No cell service, no distractions, just a few days to unwind. We arrived just before sunset, the cabin looking exactly like you'd expect from a secluded retreat, small, rustic, and surrounded by dense forest. That night, we gathered around the fireplace, sipping drinks and chatting. The place felt cozy, warm even. But as the evening went on, something felt off. The air grew heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Every now and then, we heard faint knocks on the windows, but when we checked, there was nothing there. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just the wind. But then, when we were heading to bed, I noticed something strange. The door to the basement was ajar. I could have sworn we'd closed it earlier. I mentioned it to the group, but they shrugged it off. We were all tired, and the subject was dropped. The night was quiet at first. But then, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft tapping sound. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone was knocking at the door. I lay there frozen, listening. The knock stopped, but the silence that followed felt even more unsettling. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, but it didn't stop the creeping dread in the pit of my stomach. Around 3 a.m., the tapping returned, this time louder, more insistent. Then came a low voice, barely audible, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. It whispered my name. Let me in. I sat up in bed, heart racing. My mind raced to explain it away. Maybe it was one of my friends playing a joke. But when I looked around, everyone was sound asleep. I didn't move. I couldn't. The air in the room felt thick, like something was pressing in on me. The voice came again, louder this time. Let me in. The door to my room creaked as if something was gently pushing against it. I wanted to scream, to wake up my friends, but I couldn't make a sound. It felt like whatever was outside could hear my every breath, my every movement. I didn't dare make a sound. The door suddenly burst open with a loud bang, and I froze. But there was nothing there, no person, no figure. Just the dark, empty hallway. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt my legs shake as I got out of bed. I crept toward the door, my every instinct telling me to run, but I had to know what was going on. I stepped into the hallway, and as I looked down at the basement door, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The door was now wide open. I knew I had closed it earlier. There was no way it had been left open. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and slowly made my way down the stairs, my heart thudding in my chest. The basement was cold, unnaturally cold. I shone my light around, scanning the dark corners, the old shelves, the dusty floor. Then, in the farthest corner, I saw it, a mirror. Old, cracked, with a thick layer of dust covering it. But it wasn't the mirror that made my blood run cold, it was the reflection. I saw myself standing there, flashlight in hand, but the reflection wasn't quite right. My face was twisted, eyes hollow, grinning in a way I never would. It was like looking at a version of myself that wasn't human. I stepped back in shock, tripping over a box behind me. As I fell, I turned around to find the mirror was gone, vanished, just like that. I ran back upstairs, shaking with fear. When I reached the top of the stairs, the knocking on the door started again, louder, more frantic, and the voice whispering my name again, calling to me. Let me in. I didn't want to go near the door. I didn't want to even look at it, but somehow, I found myself at the door. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. There was no one there. Just empty air, the hallway stretching before me. But that's when I noticed that the mirror it was in the hallway now, standing in front of my bedroom door. And as I stared into the reflection, I realized with horror the twisted version of myself was still there, smiling back at me. When I was invited to stay at a friend's new place, I was excited. It was an old Victorian-style house, the kind you imagine in stories. They had recently moved in, and we were supposed to be spending the weekend there, unpacking and setting things up. I didn't think anything was unusual at first, just the charm of the house, the antique furniture, the large, dimly lit rooms. But as soon as night fell, things started to change. It wasn't obvious at first. We were in the living room playing cards and chatting. My friend's dog was curled up by the fireplace, and we were having a good time. That's when I heard it, a soft thud. It came from upstairs, where the bedrooms were. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was the house settling or the dog moving. But then there was another thud, followed by a dragging sound. I looked at my friend, but they didn't seem to notice. Did you hear that? I asked, a little unsure of myself. Hear what? They replied, clearly distracted by the game. I swear I heard something upstairs, I said. My voice quieter than I meant. They just waved it off, probably thinking it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was too quiet, too still, and those noises, those dragging, faint sounds, they didn't sit right with me. Later, that night, around midnight, we were heading to bed. I took the guest room, which was at the far end of the hall. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath in the air, even though the house was warm. I brushed it off, thinking the room might be poorly insulated. I laid down, trying to fall asleep, but the house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses on your eardrums. I could hear my heartbeat, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen far below, and then more thuds. This time, they were louder. The floorboards creaked above me, followed by that dragging noise again. I shot up in bed. The dog had started barking downstairs, frantic and urgent. I didn't know what to do. I had always been skeptical about haunted house stories, but this felt different. There was something alive in that house, something that didn't belong. I grabbed my phone, prepared to text my friend, but before I could, The door to my room creaked open. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone walk down the hall. No footsteps. No sound of the door handle turning. But there it was, the door wide open, letting in only darkness. I didn't dare move. I couldn't. The dog's barking stopped abruptly. A heavy silence followed, thick and suffocating. I stared at the door, willing it to close, to end this feeling of being watched. Then, just as I thought I might be losing my mind, I heard it. A whisper, low and rasping, coming from the hall. "I'm here." It was a voice, but not a human one. It was too deep, too gravelly, like something trying to speak through the walls. I wanted to scream, but my body refused to move. I didn't dare look into the hallway, but I could feel whatever it was there, watching me. It wasn't just the house anymore, it was something else, something that had been waiting. I finally managed to get my legs under me, and I ran out of the room, down the hallway. I was panicking now, heart pounding in my chest. I banged on my friend's door. They opened it, half asleep, but I could see they were immediately shaken by my expression. "What's wrong?" they asked, looking around. "You need to get out," I whispered, trying to control my breathing. "There's something in the house." "I heard it, it's here." They looked at me, their face a mix of confusion and concern. But before they could respond, the dragging sound returned. It was louder now, closer. I turned toward the stairs, and there, standing at the top of the staircase, was the dog. But the dog wasn't barking. Its eyes were wide, pupils dilated. Its body was stiff, as if it had seen something it couldn't process. It was staring at something or someone that I couldn't see. I stepped back, and that's when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. Slow, deliberate, like someone was savoring the moment. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs. My friend and I stood frozen, not daring to make a sound. And then, just as the silence became unbearable, the dog turned and bolted toward the door. Without thinking, we followed. I didn't care about the rest of the house. I didn't care if we had to leave everything behind. I just had to get out. We made it to the car and drove off without looking back. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, I was shaking, my mind racing with what I had felt, what I had heard. But here's the part that still chills me to the bone. When I checked my phone, I saw I had a text from my friend. It had been sent hours earlier. While I was still in my room, it said simply, "You're not alone." A few friends, a remote location, and no distractions, just the way we wanted it. The cabin was a little older than we expected, but it had character. We arrived just before sunset and spent the evening laughing around the fire pit, exchanging old stories. The atmosphere felt peaceful, but as the sun set, a strange quiet settled in, the kind of silence that feels too heavy. I chalked it up to the isolation, but a creeping sense of unease grew as the night wore on. We retired to our rooms after a while. My room was upstairs at the end of a narrow hallway, and I felt an odd tension the moment I closed the door behind me. The sounds from the house were creaking. The wind outside were expected, but then I started hearing something else, a tapping. Faint at first, like someone knocking softly on the door, followed by a dragging noise. I froze, heart pounding. I was certain it wasn't the wind. I lay still, trying to listen. Another tap. Then something that sounded like fingernails scraping against the door frame. My skin prickled. I had to get up, but I didn't want to. My hand hovered over the door handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I waited, trying to tell myself it was just the house settling. The noise stopped. For a long time, there was nothing, and I convinced myself it was over. But just as I thought I might be able to sleep, there came a voice, soft, almost a whisper. "Let me in." I nearly screamed. The voice sounded too close, like it was coming from just outside my door. It wasn't a prank. I knew that much. I could feel it in my bones. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I sat against the door, every part of me screaming to run. I glanced around the room, searching for something to use as a weapon. But I couldn't bring myself to open the door. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I don't know. Eventually, the knocking stopped. The voice didn't return. I tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The next morning, I found my friends already downstairs. They were chatting, completely unaware of the events from the night before. I didn't mention it, who would believe me? Instead, we spent the day exploring the surrounding woods, trying to forget the oppressive silence that had followed us all night. Later that evening, we sat around the fireplace again, talking casually, but the nagging feeling returned. The wind outside was picking up again, howling through the trees. As we chatted, I noticed something odd. There were scratch marks on the door frame. I hadn't seen them before, but there they were, deep, jagged gouges like something had been clawing at the door. I tried to shake it off, but as the night went on, the air grew thicker, colder. Then, at exactly midnight, a sudden loud bang shook the cabin. My heart stopped. It sounded like something or someone had struck the door with force. We all froze, staring at the door as if waiting for it to open. Mark, who had been the most skeptical, stood up slowly. "I'll check it out," he said. We didn't stop him. It was stupid, but in the moment, we were all too frozen to act. He opened the door, stepped out into the hallway, and looked around. There was nothing there, no one, just an empty corridor. He turned to look back at us, his face pale. "You're not going to believe this," he said quietly, confused. We all moved into the hallway to see what he was talking about. The door frame was covered in fresh, deep scratches. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the door was a handprint. It was smeared in something dark, something that didn't belong. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't paint. It looked like blood. None of us said anything at first. The air felt heavy. I glanced down the hallway, my blood running cold. The door to the attic, which had been closed earlier, was now ajar. A faint light flickered inside. Without thinking, I moved towards it, my steps slow and hesitant. We had to know what was happening. The others followed me, but no one spoke. As I approached the attic stairs, I heard something that froze me in place, the sound of someone breathing. Shallow, ragged breaths, from inside the attic. I turned to the others, and Mark motioned for us to stay quiet. He approached the stairs and slowly reached for the light switch. The attic light flickered on. We waited, breath held, as the shadows parted to reveal an empty room, except for one thing. In the far corner, there was a full-length mirror. I hadn't noticed it before, and as I looked into it, I saw something that made my heart race. Standing behind us, reflected in the glass, was the unmistakable figure of a woman. A pale, gaunt figure with hollow eyes, but no one else saw her. In the room. Just in the mirror. Suddenly, the house seemed to shudder as if it had come alive. The mirror cracked, and then everything went black. We ran. We didn't stop until we were far from the cabin, hearts still pounding, and we never spoke of that night again.